So we're here in the heart of the nation on the National Mall, where thousands of practitioners have gathered from all over the United States to call for an end to this persecution in China against Falun Dafa. It's been going on for 24 years. So I want to show you the environment here as people are setting up and really just trying to listen to speakers as they're doing government work to try to really call attention to this persecution. So you have some people holding signs saying, stop the persecution of Falun Gong in China. Then you have others who are holding photos of loved ones, and this is really the key here because so many people in China, even to this day, have been persecuted by the CCP's persecution against this practice. So they're just commemorating those lives that have been lost. So this will start with a rally where once we pan over to the stage, you'll see it's actually happening right here in front of the Capitol, really putting pressure on government officials to end this persecution. It looks like they're actually starting the speeches right now. So this is a very widely persecuted group in China. And actually, Congress just passed a bill this year to end forced organ harvesting against these spiritual believers because Falun Dafa practitioners are a target of forced organ harvesting. So the U.S. Congress is really taking notice here. And a State Department report revealed that of all the people detained in China for their spiritual beliefs, 80% of those are Falun Dafa practitioners. So this is a very widely persecuted group inside China. We'll hear some of those persecution stories later because this is a systematic persecution by the CCP. It's not just being imprisoned. There's also torture going on. There's also been a media campaign in China to try to put pressure on Falun Dafa practitioners to give up their practice, which really puts a lot of pressure for them in the eye of the public to renounce their beliefs, which is super difficult. So this is the message they're trying to send here, trying to raise awareness, and we'll be following this rally and the parade as our show continues.
The Communism Memorial Foundation, we are dedicated to the more than 100 million who have been murdered by communist regimes, and the more than 1.5 billion people today who still live under communism. As a foundation dedicated to freedom and education, we will continue to fight and stand for all of those, particularly those and the hundreds of millions that have left the Chinese Communist Party. The systematic persecution of people of faith has long been a staple of the Chinese Communist Party. Sadly, for the past 24 years, the Falun Gong movement has been a tragic thread in the tapestry of the CCP's oppression and persecution. Founded as a peaceful spiritual organization, it is now compelled to operate underground, hidden from the long arm of the Chinese Communist Party. As the CCP threatens the most sacred right, the right to religious freedom, it is critical that we all condemn its heinous acts. In July of 1999, after recognizing the influence the Falun Gong on its practitioners, the Chinese Communist Party banned it from China. To try to stop future generations from practicing Falun Gong, schools across the nation were obliged to indoctrinate children, branding it as a heretical cult. Those who persisted in exercising their religious liberties were arrested and imprisoned. Many were sent to camps and were tortured and murdered by this regime. Thousands of Falun Gong practitioners are still detained in China today and are subject to torture, and specifically one of the most heinous crimes against humanity, forced organ harvesting. The grotesque practice of forced organ harvesting is one of the CCP's most abhorrent acts of oppression. The CCP has stated that these organs are donated voluntarily, but a countless body of evidence now proves otherwise. The China Tribunal, an independent international people's tribunal, definitively stated that it is sure beyond reasonable doubt that the forced harvesting of organs from religious prisoners in China, Falun Gong, Christians, and Muslims, has been state-organized on a huge scale. These human rights abuses committed by the CCP have been decried by multiple international bodies, including the United Nations and the European Parliament. both of which have called for investigations into forced organ harvesting targeting ethnic, religious, or linguistic minorities. The China Tribunal specifically refers to the suffering of Falun Gong, stating forced organ harvesting has been committed for years throughout China on a significant scale, and that Falun Gong practitioners have been one and probably the main source of organ supply. It estimates that hundreds of thousands have been killed in order to harvest their organs. In response, the UN human rights experts have called on China to promptly respond to the allegations of organ harvesting and to allow for independent monitoring and international human rights mechanisms. Sadly, we know that the regime will not and will continue to reject the call for human rights from around the world. Recently, Ethan Gutman, the senior research fellow from the Victims of Communism Foundation and our China Studies program, and co-founder of the International Coalition to End Transplant Abuse in China, delivered a keynote speech at the International Society for Heart and Lung Transplantation's annual meeting, highlighting the impactful report we released last year, which demonstrated conclusively that Chinese surgeons had been turned into executioners, that their surgeries were used to execute political prisoners under the scalpel for the purpose of forced organ harvesting. As a result of this powerful research and advocacy, last year, the International Society for Heart and Lung Transplantation banned the inclusion of Chinese transplant data or papers from its publications. This was a hugely important step, and now we need to encourage and demand that other medical organizations do likewise. And we must work to ensure that all U.S. hospitals and universities end any relationships they have with these brutal executioners. In the face of the flagrant and stubborn opposition by the CCP, we continue to see glimmers like this of hope. Just this past March, the House voted nearly unanimously to pass the Forced Organ Harvesting Act, which expands the U.S. government's power to directly combat organ harvesting by imposing harsher penalties for purchasing organs, imposing sanctions on individuals and government officials in countries who support forced organ harvesting and trafficking, and mandates new reporting on human organ trafficking in foreign countries and on U.S. institutions that train organ transplant surgeons. Hopefully, the Senate will soon pass the Stop Forced Organ Harvesting Act. And just this past month, Texas was the first state to pass a law to combat the CCP's forced organ harvesting of Falun Gong practitioners by banning insurance companies from covering organ transplants in countries that commit state-sanctioned forced organ harvesting. As the first law in the United States to address the medical complicity and organ tourism in China, it serves as an example to be replicated across the United States and around the world. The Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation urges all of us and those around the world to hold accountable the Chinese Communist Party and other foreign governments or entities responsible for their complicity in these vile and heinous human rights abuses. We will continue to raise our voice against the Chinese Communist Party's crimes and demand that human rights and justice for all the victims of the CCP, especially the practitioners of Falun Gong. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador. The next speaker is Darren Spink, Research Fellow from the Henry Jackson Society.
Good afternoon. My name is Darren Spink. I'm with the Henry Jackson Society, and it is truly an honor to speak before so many distinguished attendees and speakers for the second year in a row. I'm going to begin my brief remarks by repeating a mantra of former Ambassador for Religious Freedom Sam Brownback, which I also mentioned at last year's event. Religious freedom is for everyone, everywhere, all the time. In America and Europe, we often hear about the plights of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, the Buddhists in Tibet, and the persecuted Christians throughout China, including the Mayflower Church congregants who fled persecution in the PRC for Texas. The persecution of these religious groups have rightfully received considerable attention. As Congressman Mike Gallagher has recently noted, the CCP has embarked on a 10-year effort, perhaps even longer, to synthesize religion, including rewriting the Holy Bible and other religious texts. Congressman Gallagher, the chairman of the CCP Select Committee, also noted that in Henan Province, the sacred Ten Commandments have been replaced with Xi Jinping thought. Besides the aforementioned religious groups, Falun Gong practitioners also deserve attention from our policymakers for the plight they have faced. Since the CCP crackdown began on the Falun Gong in 1999, it is estimated that millions have been detained or imprisoned, and as mentioned earlier, tens of thousands reportedly killed from organ harvesting, according to the UN China Tribunal testimony. In recent years, the U.S. government has taken steps to limit the persecution of Uyghurs, Buddhists, and Christians, including enforcing targeted sanctions on CCP officials, export controls, and immigration assistance to the persecuted so they can flee CCP for safer shores. For fleeing the PRC, for safer shores. It has been convenient for some, perhaps, to ignore the harassment of the Falun Gong, as it has mostly occurred in China, where the abuse, torture, and murder has largely been hidden from sight. The persecution has now reached our shores, however. In May of this year, 2 CCP agents allegedly targeted U.S.-based Falun Gong practitioners, bribing a purported IRS official in hopes of removing the nonprofit status of a Falun Gong organization. Southern District of New York U.S. Attorney Damian Williams stated, the agents, quote, allegedly waged a campaign at the behest of the government of the People's Republic of China to influence a U.S. government official in order to further the PRC's government's repression of practitioners of Falun Gong. Efforts to manipulate and use the arms of the U.S. government to carry out the PRC government's autocratic aims are as shocking as they are insidious. A month earlier, the Department of Justice charged 2 PRC Ministry of Public Security officers who organized counter-protests in Washington to silence Falun Gong advocates. The MPS officers operated out of an overseas PRC police station in New York City. In the FBI affidavit, the investigating agent wrote, the MPS's mission now extends beyond China's domestic law enforcement and into functions more associated with an intelligence service. The agent continued, the MPS routinely monitors Chinese political dissidents who live in the U.S. and use cooperative contacts to influence, threaten, and coerce political dissidents abroad. The CCP's transnational repression of religious groups on U.S. soil cannot be tolerated by the Biden administration and Congress. It is not only insidious, as the U.S. Attorney noted, but an attempt to supplant the freedoms afforded through the U.S. Constitution, including freedom of religion, speech, and assembly. As some politicians from both sides of the aisle seek closer ties with the CCP due to immense pressure from corporate America and Wall Street, Religious freedom violations impacting Falun Gong practitioners deserve greater attention from U.S. policymakers. In closing, policymakers should consider remedies to end the persecution of the Falun Gong, including capital market restrictions on outbound investment from the U.S. to China in sectors in which some investment from U.S. pension funds or other U.S. financial instruments may be used to worsen Falun Gong persecution, including investments into surveillance technologies. U.S. funds cannot be allowed to fuel the CCP and its authoritarian policies toward religion. Secondly, the U.S. should raise the persecution of the Falun Gong with its closest allies and partners in Europe and throughout the Indo-Pacific, and encourage friendly governments to take actions to restrict capital outflows which are used to further persecution, and sanction officials which allow human rights abuses to continue. Only when the CCP feels financial pain from its human rights abuses, transnational repression, and religious freedom violations will change occur from within. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Darren. Our next speaker is Piero Tosi, Staff Director of the CECC, Congressional Executive Commission on China, appointed by Chris Smith. Please welcome Mr. Tosi back again.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for that introduction. And on behalf of Chairman Chris Smith, I extend his greetings and the greetings of the Congressional Executive Commission on China. This morning, Mr. Smith, the chairman, and Senator Merkley, the co-chairman, released the following statement. For the past 24 years, Falun Gong practitioners have suffered the most appalling human rights abuses imaginable, abuses that are ongoing. Falun Gong prisoners must be released and PRC officials held accountable for their crimes. Okay? And the chairs specifically called for the unconditional release of 3 Falun Gong prisoners, Shu Na, Deng Cuiping, and Zhou Deyong, as well as all detained Falun Gong practitioners. Now, these cases and those of others can be found on our website, www.cecc.gov, if you want to find out more information. Now, of all those appalling human rights abuses inflicted upon the Falun Gong, I want to focus briefly on just one, and that's forced organ harvesting, which Ambassador Bremberg and we've heard before, but I want to underscore this because it is probably the most horrific and egregious of human rights abuses. Last year, Chairman Smith, under the auspices of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission, held a hearing entitled Forced Organ Harvesting in China, Examining the Evidence. And I think that the evidence, including circumstantial evidence, and a peer-reviewed article, which Ambassador Bremberg also referenced, that appeared in the American Journal of Transplantation, written by Matthew Robertson and Dr. Jacob Levy, that analyzed over 2,800 Chinese language academic articles, is quite compelling. At a minimum, transplant surgeons in the People's Republic of China violated the internationally accepted dead donor rule. But there is more, and I think it's the work of scholars like Victims of Communism's Ethan Gutman, as well as David Kilgore and David Mattis, point to the fact that the Falun Gong practitioners have been targeted for forced organ removal. There's no need to exaggerate evidence. What is there is sufficient. Indeed, one of our witnesses at last year's hearing, Sir Jeffrey Nice, the former chairman of the China Tribunal, has been stated before, said that forced organ harvesting has been committed for years throughout China on a significant scale, and Falun Gong practitioners have been one and probably the main source of organ supply. Today, we also have evidence of organ harvesting of young Uyghurs and other Central Asians interned in concentration camps in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. And I think it's important that the Falun Gong, who are the early targets, stand in solidarity with the Uyghurs and others who are now also being targeted. And finally, as our previous speaker also mentioned, what can Congress do? And as been mentioned, this past March, the House of Representatives passed the Stop Forced Organ Harvesting Act of 2023, H.R. 1154, authored by Chairman Chris Smith. And this bill is the organ harvesting bill which has the most realistic chance of being passed and sent to the President's desk for signature. And as been mentioned, it would bar entry by perpetrators of forced organ harvesting and subject them to sanctions. It would also require the Secretary of State to report on organ harvesting. And while the bill encompasses all countries, the focus really is on one country, and that is the People's Republic of China under Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party. As the bill has passed out of the House, it's now up to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee to mark up the bill so that it can advance to the Senate floor, and that's an action item for you. Please ask that the bill be marked up. And for our part, the CECC just last week had a hearing that looked at corporate complicity in China's human rights abuses, and we will continue to ask questions of American companies whose technology can be implicated in the forced harvesting of organs. They must make sure that their technology is not used for pernicious purposes. So we have questions for companies like Medtronic, whose ECMO machines that can transport organs were previously sold in China. We have questions for Thermo Fisher Scientific, which supplies DNA sequencers and serum treatment reagents, which have implications for organ transplantation. A fundamental question is, have these and other companies done their due diligence with regards to how their technology is used in communist China? And can they assure us that their technology is not implicated in human rights abuses, including that most heinous of all human rights abuses, the forced harvesting of human organs? I'd like to thank all of you for your commitments to human rights and to religious freedom for all, and Falun Dafa, wan sui, wan sui. 好，谢谢。
Next, I'd like to introduce someone who you should all know very well. Ms. Nina Hope Shea is the director of the Center for Religious Freedom at the Hudson Institute. Before that, she was with Freedom House and has also been a commissioner on the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. She also has been one of the most consistent speakers at this annual rally. The core of all Nina's work as a human rights lawyer has revolved around the human need to believe in something higher than ourselves. As Falun Gong practitioners, we each know this feeling deeply. That faith has the power to heal, propel us into greatness, and show us the best in each other. So, when that right to believe gets attacked, we mourn not merely our own freedoms being taken away, but the dimming of humanity's collective light. Nina was among the first to identify the Chinese Communist Party's unlawful crackdown as a genocide. In 2022, she called on American policymakers to declare the persecution as such. As a director of Freedom House in 2001, she and her colleagues awarded Falun Gong founder Master Li Hongzhi the International Religious Freedom Award. We could not ask for a better friend than Miss Nina Shea. So I'm honored and delighted to announce that Nina Shea is the winner of Friends of Falun Gong's 2023 Human Rights Award. Yes. We began this award in 2018 to recognize the people and groups who have made significant contributions to supporting Falun Gong practitioners' freedom of belief. Ms. Shea's commitment to this singular cause has demonstrated her own personal faith in the power of goodness to change the world for the better. I hope that her tireless work inspires any one of you listening to reflect on the nature of our humanness and the role spiritual faith has in it.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Alan. I am deeply honored and grateful to receive this beautiful award today. Thank you, friends of Falun Gong. I want to say that I am so honored because Falun Gong has been so courageous in facing what I believe is a genocide in China by the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party. The hallmark of this genocide, of course, is forced organ harvesting. I have reviewed all the research, interviewed the main researchers, some of whom I'm happy to say are part of the club I joined today in receiving this award, David Kilgore and David Mattis. But there are many more researchers who have documented the evidence showing that, one, there was intent to commit genocide when President of China at the time, Jiang Zemin, said he wanted to eliminate Falun Gong and created the 610, the dreadful 610 office structure to carry it out. And then the subsequent evidence, statistical, medical evidence, testimonial evidence, and so much more. I also want to point out that there is persecution against Falun Gong and other dissidents and religious minorities in the United States by the CCP. Transnational repression by the Chinese Communist Party on American soil that curtail the rights of religious freedom and freedom of speech for American citizens and American residents. This must stop. Today, the Hudson Institute, where I direct the Center for Religious Freedom, is releasing a discussion of experts on this very topic of transnational repression against the First Amendment freedoms here in the United States. And again, Falun Gong has been a prime target of that, as we saw in a FBI and Department of Justice indictment against 2 agents of the Chinese National Public Security Ministry operating a police station in New York City that plotted and carried out attacks against Falun Gong. Falun Gong is mentioned 13 times in the indictment, and against other dissidents. I also want to say that I admire Falun Gong. I admire it for your resilience. Your standing up today is an act of courage and an act of resilience. Thank you so much for inspiring us all in the free world about how you can overcome this horrific religious persecution. I have been to the Shenyun Performing Arts, and it is a beautiful reminder of Chinese culture at its best, Chinese music, Chinese history, and it was a thoroughly remarkable, stunning performance. And they too have suffered this transnational repression just for existing. So I am deeply grateful. Thank you so much. And I will not stop.
Many thanks to Nina. Our next speaker is Sean Nelson, legal counsel for for global religious freedom at the Alliance for Defending Freedom International. Please welcome Sean back.
Dear all, thank you so much for inviting me to speak to you today on this important and vital annual event. This important annual reminder of China's crimes against humanity, the necessity of the U.S. being a strong defender of freedom of religion and belief all around the world, and most importantly, the strength of your community, the Falun Gong community, in the face of decades of persecution in China. For decades, the communist regime in China has targeted the Falun Gong community for their beliefs and practices. A recent report puts the total number of Falun Gong members who have died because of torture or abuse at the hands of the Chinese Communist Party at over 5,000. Just since last year, January 2022, over 180 Falun Gong practitioners have died from persecution, and untold numbers have been the victims of the shocking practice of forced organ harvesting. It's been aptly said that the Chinese Communist Party is in a war against faith, and anyone who challenges the party merely because they deviate in their beliefs and practices from what the communist regime wants. The Falun Gong were one of the first targets, along with the Tibetan Buddhists, for the now widespread systems of mass persecution and surveillance that are being practiced against so many different religious and belief groups in China. The U.S. has rightly called the practices of the CCP against the Uyghur Muslim population a genocide. Christians are regularly harassed and arrested by the regime, and churches torn down because they recognize a higher power than the CCP. Individuals of all of these groups living outside of China often will witness their family members simply disappear within China, an agonizing and unthinkable ordeal. And China's transnational repression has stepped up over the past few years to keep anyone in any country all around the world from speaking out. That is why it is so heartening and important that you all continue to speak out, to hold this rally, to hold representatives accountable, to hold the Chinese Communist Party accountable. You are a voice not only for the Falun Gong community, but for all religious and belief minority communities being persecuted by the Chinese Communist Party. And right now, Congress should add its voice in support of you. International religious freedom and a strong stance against the CCP are strong bipartisan issues. The House of Representatives has already passed the Stop Forced Organ Harvesting Act of 2023, and the Senate should follow that and quickly do the same. So thank you all again for allowing me to be here with you and to stand alongside you and all religious and belief minorities being persecuted in China. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Katrina Landhaus-Sweat, President of the Landhaus Foundation for Human Rights and Justice. Please welcome Ms. Sweat back.
Hello, my friends. I cannot tell you how inspiring it is to stand here and see this sea of yellow, your beautiful banners, and above all, your determined, faithful, kind, intelligent, wonderful faces. You are an inspiration to every single one of us. And I thank you for being people of faith, people of enormous bravery, and very importantly, a community that in the face of unbearable persecution has made the decision not to give in, not to give up, but to stand firm and strong and tall. We love you and we admire you. Now we know that no community has suffered as much as the Falun Gong community in China. I hoped, every single one of you hoped, that we would not be meeting again year after year because we believed that this horrific and criminal targeting of innocent Falun Gong practitioners would have to end. But sadly, it has not. And the reality, the tragic truth of what is going on in China calls on each of us each year to renew our commitment to fighting for justice and fighting against the grave evil represented by the Communist Party of China. We will not forget your fellow practitioners, and we will not forget the crimes committed against them, and we will not ever give up. Now, several of the distinguished speakers who have spoken before me have talked about the fact that when you stand on behalf of your fellow Falun Dafa practitioners, you are not only standing in solidarity with your family and your friends and your co-religionists and your colleagues, but you really are standing up on behalf of freedom of religion, conscience, and belief for all people in China. And beyond that, you are standing up and saying that the world must stop living in fear of the mighty Chinese Communist Party. We must stop making excuses for their criminal conduct. And we must recognize that if we don't confront them, if we don't meet the challenge that they pose, they will continue to spread their tentacles and the threat that they pose far beyond the borders of China itself. Some of the earlier speakers have talked about the risk of transnational repression. The truly outrageous efforts by the Chinese government and their intelligence services to target people in Europe, in the United States, in Canada, in Australia, in every part of the world. This is not only an outrageous violation of international law, but it is something that should strike concern, if not fear, in the heart of every single American and every single person living in a country where China has sought to repress, to censor, to propagandize, to intimidate, to violently attack. All of these things have happened. This is no myth. This is reality. And this underscores the magnitude of the threat we are facing. Now, I would say the good news is people are starting to wake up. People are starting to recognize that this is not a benign regime with which we can seek to advance all of our commercial interests and a variety of other interests. And well, you know, we will occasionally decry their human rights abuses, but let's not spend too much time focusing on that. I think you guys know better than I do that that was sort of the mindset for a long time. And it probably has felt to you for a long time that you were sort of with a megaphone shouting on a mountaintop, but weren't necessarily getting people to listen. But my friends, I do believe that that is changing. The true nature of the regime, the true threat posed by the regime, and the global aspirations of the Chinese Communist Party are becoming increasingly evident to leaders in government, leaders in the media, and leaders in culture. And a lot of that awareness is thanks to the extraordinary work that your community has done. And what I think is particularly inspiring and remarkable is that you have fought this fight, led this charge, and yet have in no way abandoned your very high values and principles, the kindness, the compassion, the forgiveness that are the hallmarks of the Falun Dafa community. So today I'm here to express my solidarity with you, to pay tribute to you, to remember with honor and with sorrow those of your family members and community members who have suffered at the hands of the Chinese Communist regime, and to tell you that change is coming. My late father, Congressman Tom Lantos, who was the only survivor of the Holocaust ever to serve in the United States Congress, and so he knew better than almost anyone what it meant to face the worst that humanity was capable of, the greatest evil that humanity was capable of. And that experience led him to become one of our Congress's most eloquent and passionate and forceful defenders of human rights. And of course, he was a great friend of the Falun Dafa community. But he used to say to me in his very memorable way, you know, honey, whatever difficulties we're facing, whatever challenges are before us, whatever hard times we are going through, we have to remember that we are just bending a windy corner of history. And yes, we have to pull our coat tight. We might have to bow our head down to face those powerful winds. But around that windy corner are bright blue skies and wonderful possibilities. Do not give up hope. Do not give up the fight. We are still bending that windy corner of history. But thanks to your courage, your determination, your endurance, we are going to get around this corner, and there will be hope and bright blue skies ahead. Thank you so very much, and may God bless you all.
Thank you, Ms. Sweat. Our next speaker is Ariel Del Turco, Director of the Center for Religious Liberty at the Family Research Council.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's an honor to be with you today. We are gathered here to call attention to the decades of persecution that have already taken place against the Falun Gong, and even more importantly, to demand an end to that ongoing horrific persecution. The speakers at this rally come from diverse backgrounds. However, we have a few crucial things in common. We believe deeply in religious freedom. And for that, just like you, the Chinese Communist Party would like to silence us. The Chinese Constitution claims that its citizens enjoy freedom of religious belief, but the facts on the ground tell a different story. The CCP has banned the practice of Falun Gong and spread malicious propaganda against Falun Gong practitioners. Like the insecure, totalitarian regime that it is, the CCP felt threatened by the growth of Falun Gong, even though the practitioners simply wanted to practice their beliefs in peace. Those who practice Falun Gong in China are subjected to shocking violence. They are harassed, arrested, beaten, and sometimes even killed through the brutal practice of forced organ harvesting. Many of you here today know about these tragedies firsthand. But the CCP's abuses do not end at China's borders. The long arm of the CCP even reaches into the United States, harassing and terrifying Chinese dissidents who've escaped. In May of this year, 2 Los Angeles residents were charged for participating in a Chinese government scheme to target dissidents. They were caught supporting CCP efforts to strip the tax-exempt status of an American Falun Gong entity. In April, federal prosecutors charged 2 more people in New York City with acting as unregistered agents of the Chinese government. One of the tasks that the CCP gave them was to organize counter-protests against the Falun Gong right here in Washington, D.C. The CCP's oppression of Falun Gong practitioners is beyond unacceptable. Every individual has the right to choose what they believe and to live out their faith, even if that faith is not recognized by the CCP. Religious freedom is a fundamental human right owed to all people, and if China wants to participate on the world stage as an equal, China must learn to respect it. Through its persecution of the Falun Gong, as well as Christians, Uyghur Muslims, Tibetan Buddhists, and others, the CCP has made clear that it does not respect any individual's right to live according to the dictates of their conscience. For some, religious freedom is a matter of life and death. It cannot be a feel-good side issue to American foreign policy. It must be a priority because the stakes are high. Many people call the Chinese government a competitor of the United States. In reality, it is the biggest threat to human rights in the world today. The U.S. occupies a powerful position in global affairs, and we ought to rise to that moral calling. Congress can start by passing the Stop Forced Organ Harvesting Act. It passed in the House earlier this year, and it needs to be voted on in the Senate. This bill would expand the U.S. government's power to combat organ harvesting. It's an important step towards holding the CCP accountable for the atrocities committed against Falun Gong practitioners. Human rights are inherent. They are not granted by any government, nor can they be rightly taken away by any government. And despite its political strength, the CCP does not have the authority to erase them. No one, anywhere, should be persecuted for their beliefs. The rest of the world cannot continue watching these abuses in silence. Today, we demand religious freedom in China for Falun Gong practitioners and for all people. And we demand that the CCP be held accountable for its actions. Thank you all for coming out today and for being a voice for those who cannot speak up for themselves. Thank you.
Thank you, Ariel. Our next speaker is Sarah Cook, Senior Advisor at Freedom House.
Good afternoon. 大家好. Though it is an honor to join you for this important rally, we really shouldn't have to be here again. Yet here we are, calling on the Chinese Communist Party to end its persecution of Falun Gong practitioners and other religious believers in China. Once again calling on the Chinese government to uphold its own laws and international commitments. 24 years after former CCP leader Jiang Zemin arbitrarily launched a campaign to wipe out the beliefs of tens of millions of Chinese citizens, the brutal persecution of Falun Gong practitioners continues, even after his death last year. Over the past year, in our China Media Bulletin, Freedom House has followed various cases of Falun Gong practitioners detained for simply sharing information or for trying to counter the CCP's censorship, not only about their own faith or about rights abuses in China, but also about conditions during COVID-19 lockdowns. Ms. Xu Na from Beijing, herself a widow after her husband was killed in the persecution of Falun Gong, is now serving an 8-year sentence for sharing such information with an overseas website. Just last month, He Binggang and his fiancée, both Falun Gong believers from Shanghai, were sentenced to 6 and 5 years for aiding development of a tool to help Chinese citizens access blocked websites. These individuals and others like them are at risk of torture and even death in custody. In December, a radio host named Pang Xun from Sichuan province was killed in custody. He was serving a 5-year prison sentence for what? Handing out leaflets related to Falun Gong. He was only 30 years old when he was killed. And we know about his death, despite the regime's tight censorship, thanks to a former classmate who shared the news and photos of him on Twitter. Pang is just one of now over 5,000 Falun Gong practitioners whose death from persecution has been documented by overseas Falun Gong researchers. But as we've heard, that's just the tip of the iceberg. The CCP's campaign is actually not only about Falun Gong. It has impacted so much more than only that community. It has undermined the rule of law in China for over 2 decades and contributed to attacks on human rights lawyers like Gao Zhisheng, who have tried to defend Falun Gong practitioners. It has fueled the spread of high-tech surveillance technologies and the censorship of the Great Firewall. It has driven inhumane advancements in extracting organs from living prisoners of conscience for organ transplants. And some of the very officials who have led the current campaign of atrocities targeting Uyghurs and other Muslims in Xinjiang have been promoted to those positions after perfecting repressive techniques on Tibetans and Falun Gong practitioners. Nor is this campaign only posing a threat to people within China. Under Xi Jinping's leadership, the government has intensified efforts to extend its repression abroad. The Chinese Communist Party leads an enormous global propaganda and media influence campaign and conducts the most extensive campaign of transnational repression of any country in the world. We are learning more about how this campaign is operating in the United States as the Department of Justice identifies and brings charges against those carrying it out. As has been mentioned before, in May, the latest scheme to target Falun Gong practitioners involved a brazen attempt to bribe a U.S. tax official, who turned out to be an undercover FBI agent, into revoking the tax-exempt status of a Falun Gong nonprofit. Moreover, in Hong Kong, after adoption of the national security law and the hundreds of prosecutions we've seen, it's very worrisome to consider that the authorities may soon turn their sights on religious communities, especially Catholics and Falun Gong practitioners. But despite this grim reality, we are not without hope. Millions of religious believers of all faith, including Falun Gong practitioners, defy official restrictions in daily life or engage in some form of direct protest, at times scoring significant victories, and as interviews I've done with various people from China, actually really winning the hearts and minds of more and more Chinese people. Believers have responded to CCP persecution with tenacity, nonviolence, and creativity, and they have helped secure the release of detainees and saved lives. The U.S. government has recently sanctioned Chinese officials responsible for committing rights violations against religious and ethnic minorities, including against Falun Gong practitioners. But more must be done. The U.S. government should sanction Chinese officials responsible for the persecution of Falun Gong also at the central level and in northeastern China, where the persecution is most widespread and deadly. Today, we call for the release of all those wrongfully detained, for the closure of all prison and detention camps in China, and we stand in solidarity with all of you and your families who are victims of religious persecution. We call on the U.S. government, businesses, and all those listening to do all they can to stand with the people of China, to not succumb to the CCP's well-funded pressure to remain silent, to bring accountability to those perpetrating abuses, and to stand with all those defending and upholding rights in China so that we can ultimately bring freedom to Falun Gong and to all of the people of China. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sarah. Our next speaker is Wendy Wright, President of the Christian Freedom International.
I want to thank you for being here today. My first personal introduction to the Falun Gong was nearly 20 years ago as I was walking along the mall and I saw a demonstration just like this. And I'd heard of the Falun Gong before that, but this was the first time where I witnessed and saw the gentle, persistent nature of those involved in with Falun Gong and exposing the evils of the Chinese Communist Party. Last year, I was able to visit some Chinese Christians who had fled China together as a church. They've been nicknamed the Mayflower Church because they're just simply seeking religious freedom. But in order to live out their faith, they had to leave China. But the CCP pursued them to Korea, to Thailand, and now here in the US, there's concern that they could even be bothered or harassed here. And thankfully, there were congressmen, the US State Department, and just average citizens who helped to rescue this group of Chinese Christians and get them to freedom and out of the clutches of the communists. And a reason why congressmen, US State Department, average citizens were willing to step up and speak out is because they knew what would happen if these Chinese citizens were forced back to China. And a reason why they know, why we all know, is in part because of what you are doing, what the Falun Gong is doing, by exposing the atrocities of the Chinese communists. Your efforts are making a huge difference. Your gentle, persistent witness is critical to opposing the evil of the Chinese Communist Party. Your witness, your speaking out, your exposing of the evil encourages government leaders to act. You're awakening citizens. You're pressuring corporations to not be linked with the Communist Chinese. You are pricking the consciences of people. Now, sadly, there are still too many accomplices, both in and outside of China. Too many people who are willing to link arms with the Chinese communists to help them to commit these atrocities. And they need to be shamed and their efforts criminalized as accessories to crimes against human nature. But there are also some who are accomplices unwittingly. They simply are not yet aware. And that's why, again, what you're doing is so important. And I'm so pleased to be able to link arms with you in exposing the atrocities so that no one can say that they did not know. So I want to encourage you, do not weary in doing good. At the right time, you will reap a harvest if you don't give up. God bless you.
Thank you, Wendy. Our next speaker is Faith McDonald, Director of Advocacy at the Caterismos Global, Inc. Please welcome Faith back. She's been one of our...
All right, so we're still here on the National Mall where we heard from a handful of speakers of government organizations, religious organizations talking about why this persecution against this spiritual practice, Falun Dafa, needs to come to an end. A lot of people honed in on the Forced Organ Harvesting Act, which Congress just passed during this Congress that, takes action. The U.S. government takes action against this forced organ harvesting where oftentimes these Falun Dafa practitioners are the victims of in China. Other speakers praise these practitioners for continuing to stand up to end this persecution even after 24 years. So that's the situation going on the ground right now. These practitioners are holding out strong. It's quite hot out here. They're standing strong with their signs, really dedicated to raising this awareness. So what's going to happen next is they're going to line up and do a parade march down the streets of Washington, D.C. They're going to go down Constitution Avenue, Pennsylvania Avenue to really raise awareness not only to the U.S. government and the speakers that are here, but also the passersby and the cars that are driving by as well. So we'll be following that parade with you along as well.
Good afternoon to everyone tuning in right now. Welcome to NTD's live coverage of the 2023 parade to end the persecution of Falun Gong. I'm Evelyn Lee.
And I'm Jack Bradley. We're following a big event in our nation's capital today. Thousands of Falun Gong adherents and supporters are out rallying for human rights today. If you caught the online live broadcast of the rally in front of Capitol Hill, you know we had numerous speakers for this cause, ranging from lawmakers to victims of the Chinese Communist Party. And joining us here in the studio, we have Levi Browdy with us today. Levi is the executive director of the Falun Dafa Information Center, and he'll be giving us some insight into the situation in China and how they've been affected. So Levi, let's start off. Can you tell us about the Falun Dafa Information Center and what's your role?
Sure. It's a volunteer organization that we first started, literally weeks, a few months after the persecution first started. And then what we were trying to do is get firsthand accounts, eyewitness accounts of what was happening on the ground all over China, out of China, and into the hands of policymakers, human rights groups, people that can do something about it. And I've served as the volunteer executive director for the organization.
And I'd like to back up a bit now and ask you, what is Falun Dafa?
Sure. So Falun Dafa, also known as Falun Gong, is a Buddhist-based spiritual practice that involves the sitting meditation, slow motion exercises that look a little like Tai Chi, and the studying of Buddhist-based principles, primarily truthfulness, compassion, and forbearance. And so there are books in Falun Gong that you can read that sort of elaborate on these principles and teach you how to adopt them into your life as you go through your life.
Now that sounds, just by the name, right? It sounds Chinese, so it seems like it's an Asian faith based in Asian tradition. So how did you come to that?
Well, a good friend who was Chinese, we had a small startup software company in New York City, and he went back to Beijing as he does every year to visit his parents, and he came back, and honestly, I mean, he's a good friend, but he's a little gruff. But he came back and he's like helping people around the office. He's like, lending a hand and doing all these things. So I remember very vividly one day we sort of gathered around his desk and said, all right, man, what are you doing? What's going on? And he said, hey, I learned this Buddhist-based practice from my mom. And he taught some of us. And so this little software startup company, every morning we'd go out to the park outside of our little complex and we do the exercises, the meditation, and several of us started practicing.
Okay, sorry to cut you short here.
Yeah, we're going to bring in a reporter on the ground. Melina Wisecup, she's on the ground in the nation's capital right now. She'll be following along with us today. Melina, tell us more about today's parade route.
Hi, Jack. Yeah, so the street where I'm standing on, this massive parade is about to unfold with thousands of practitioners from all over the United States to raise awareness about the 24-year-long persecution against this spiritual discipline. So the route is going to go down Constitution Avenue, take a turn on 7th Street, and then back down Pennsylvania Avenue, right towards the Capitol, really sending a message to those government officials about why it's important to end this persecution. This is a 24-year-long persecution. As you can see behind me, that marching band is coming, and they're really just trying to light up the streets and show why this spiritual practice is good. And then you have people following them, holding tons of signs, telling, what is the practice? It's truthfulness, compassion, forbearance, telling about the movement that they've started to get Chinese people to end to quit the Chinese Communist Party, as well as others just showing signs, stop the persecution, very simple messages, but really just trying to serve a purpose of raising awareness. So let's take a listen to that band really quick so you can just hear the uplifting music that they're performing for people on the streets here today. And it's just now getting started, Jack, so we're just going to try to zoom in a little bit and show you kind of what we see. Policemen are kind of in the front here.
Thank you so much, Melina. It seems like we'll have 1 more or 2 more minutes until we have really our eyes and ears on that band. But from what I can hear, really upbeat music. We will be checking in with you more throughout the day. But first, for those that just are tuning in, we're going to give you a quick rundown on things before we dive deeper into today's parade. So first things first, what is Falun Gong? It's also known as Falun Dafa, and it's an ancient spiritual meditation practice. And here's the thing, Jack already just mentioned that they are rallying for human rights. That's because they have been heavily persecuted in China. Grim reports have been coming out like labor camps, letters hidden in cheaply made toys, or organs being sold for profit, and so much proof of human rights violations. And all this was kickstarted on this day 24 years ago by the communist regime.
That's right. And while we're watching the Tianguo marching band approach, Levi, I'd like to ask you really quick, what does the words Falun Dafa mean?
So Falun Dafa is sort of the official name of the spiritual practice. It technically means Dharma or law wheel. Great law, Dharma wheel. It's sort of those two words put together. It's a little hard to translate. In colloquial terms, it's known as Falun Gong, but it's really the formal name of the spiritual practice. Yeah.
And it looks like we're pretty close now to the band.
That's right, yeah. We have our eyes on Falun Dafa practitioners playing instruments. This is the Tianguo Marching Band. Tianguo translates to heavenly worlds. The marching band plays all original scores plus some classical American marching pieces. Let's take a look, listen, and enjoy. The band was established in New York in 2005, and it now extends to over 20 countries. Those playing in the band are members of the spiritual group Falun Gong, which is being persecuted and demonized by the communist regime in China. And some of these band members and their families were thrown into prison and tortured for their beliefs. Despite that adversity, the band's members say it's all the more special because it was formed for a shared cause. Among the band members are teenagers as well as seniors who've never touched an instrument before. Members from various backgrounds and professions are also part of the band.
Now, and as we have just heard, the band just officially kick-started the parade today to commemorate all the victims and deaths because of the CCP in China. Now, it's 24 years of persecution this year. That's an entire generation worth of people if you think about it. Since we have Levi Browdy with us today, he is the Executive Director of Falun Dafa Information Center, we want to give you, our audience, the chance to ask your questions as well. So ask away in the comment sections of YouTube, our Facebook live stream, or Epoch TV, of course. So we will try our best to take out some time out of our day and answer them as well.
And now, Levi, I'd like to ask you about the name Falun Dafa, Falun Gong. It has two names. Why is that?
So Qigong practices have been very popular in China for thousands of years, and there's all kinds of this gong, that gong. So when Falun Dafa, which is the formal name of the practice, was first introduced, colloquially, people sort of adopted the first term of it, Falun, and called it Falun Gong, like they'd call other things this gong or that gong. So it's really just a colloquial term for the spiritual practice. It's the same thing.
And what sets it apart from other Qigong or even Tai Chi?
Well, I think the main component that sets it apart is the spiritual aspect. Tai Chi and a lot of Qigongs are strictly about health, by and large, energy centers and sort of making sure the body is very healthy. Falun Gong has that, but it brings to the table a very spiritual component that's very traditional and rooted in traditional Chinese culture.
Now, if you're just joining us right now, this is the live coverage of the parade calling for an end to the persecution of Falun Gong in China. Let's see really quick how the parade is progressing here. We are just seeing, leading the way to the next section, a big banner that reads Falun Dafa in English as well as Mandarin Chinese. And behind that, we see another big banner that has these three, I believe we touched on it earlier, these three core characters of Falun Gong called Zhen Shanren in Chinese and truthfulness, benevolence, and forbearance in English. The organizers today are expecting thousands to come out to call for an end of the horrific human rights violations in China.
Practitioners of Falun Dafa strive to live by the principles of truth, compassion, and forbearance. Many have said after taking up the practice, they have experienced life-changing benefits to their health and their state of mind. The practice is free and open to all. And so, Levi, I want to ask you, what are the notable benefits of practicing Falun Dafa?
I think that's one thing that's noticeable right off the bat is the physical health and the energy. That's immediate. Sometimes you just start doing the exercise the first 15, 20 minutes and you immediately sort of sense that. And it's quite profound. People who have trouble sleeping or have chronic other issues resolve fairly quickly through the practice. So that's the immediate benefit that really most people take note of right away.
And a core aspect of this practice is character, improving character. Can you break that down?
Yeah, and I think that's what really sets it apart, and that's what really made it have quite a universal appeal, is that it's teaching you how to be a good person. Now that sounds simple, but we all know, we go through the day and we get people yelling at us, difficult situations, a mother-in-law doing this or that. It's hard to be truthful, compassionate, and tolerant every moment of the day as you go through that. And so how do you strive to do that? How do you actually accomplish that and bring that into your life? That's where I'd say the real magic of the teachings comes into play, because it really guides you on doing that and becoming a better person in line with those principles. And that's something that's amazing, and I think that really resonates with a lot of people.
Yeah, it's a little tests every day that prove character, right?
That's absolutely right. And the founder of the spiritual practice is Mr. Li Hongzhi. Who is he? Here's an introduction.
The founder of Falun Gong, Mr. Li Hongzhi, was born in May 1951 in China's Jilin province. From a young age, he was trained as a disciple in Falun Dafa, an ancient Qigong practice to cultivate mind and body. After several decades of arduous training, he decided to share the practice with the general public. Mr. Li introduced it on May 13, 1992, calling it Falun Gong. Falun Gong spread quickly in China, with practitioners sharing accounts of remarkable physical and mental benefits after taking up the discipline. Practitioners respectfully give Mr. Li the title of Master, as is traditional for a Qigong teacher in China. Master Li received numerous awards from Chinese state institutions for his work alleviating illnesses across China. In 1995, the Chinese embassy in France invited him to Paris to give a workshop. Master Li and Falun Gong have continued to enjoy widespread popularity despite the Chinese Communist Party's ongoing campaign to smear him since 1999. From 2000 to 2003, Master Li Hongzhi was nominated 4 times for the Nobel Peace Prize. He has received hundreds of awards and recognitions worldwide, including recognition as an outstanding spiritual leader by the Asia-Pacific Human Rights Foundation. He is ranked among one of the top 100 living geniuses, a list compiled by the global consulting firm Creator Synectics. Today, as many as 100 million people worldwide practice Falun Gong and live by its principles of truthfulness, Zhen, compassion, Shan, and tolerance, Run.
Very interesting. And so after Mr. Li Hongzhi introduced Falun Gong to the public, it really just took a few years until millions of people were practicing this in parks, as you have just seen. And prior to 1990, maybe for people that haven't been in China, it's actually pretty common to see people around in parks doing Qigong exercises, singing, and all these type of things. So prior to 1999, it was really Falun Gong exercises. But I'm wondering, in such a short span of time, how did it become so popular?
Entirely word of mouth, which I think is the miraculous thing. It wasn't like there was a big promotion campaign or anything like that through China. Mr. Li was invited to give lectures for about 2 years, from 92 to 94, in different parts of China. But really, it was, the health benefits we talked about before, the spiritual sort of depth that people read in it, people telling their friends and family, and that's really how it took off in China.
Interesting.
And we'll see in the center of the symbol of Falun Dafa is what looks to be a swastika. Many people are alarmed by this, but it's actually an ancient Chinese symbol. Can you talk more about this?
Yeah, I've had an uncomfortable initially conversation with one of my Jewish relatives about this. So yes, if you go to Asia, what most people don't know is if you go to a Buddhist temple in Asia, anywhere in Asia, you will see what we recognize as the swastika symbol on the chest of Buddhas or the hands of Buddhas or adorned along Buddhist temples. It's a symbol of the Buddha in most Asian cultures, certainly, and all that comes out of Buddhism. And so for there, it goes back thousands of years, and it's a very sort of sacred symbol.
All right, thank you for that insight, Levi. And recently, NTD as well as the Epoch Times were allowed to publish 2 exclusive articles, the first ever news articles by Mr. Li Hongzhi. What's so interesting are the many similarities of faith between East and West, almost surprisingly similar. Here are some reactions from our readers. Watch.
I actually felt great because of my beliefs that coincide with his. And it gave me a very calming feeling that there's no fear, you know, in dying.
Well, I found it very much like my own belief systems. Obviously, I think there's a lot of similarities between Falun Gong and the Eastern philosophies of Hinduism and Buddhism.
You know, he does give me some enlightenment on, you know, the spiritual aspect of life, and you know, he talks about karma, which isn't talked in the Christian religion. But yes, I think it's applicable here for me, and I think everyone.
It confirmed what I believe in the big picture of things, how life, we go through life, the progression of the universe, how it works.
About what is life and what is death, and how do things exist.
You know, Mr. Hongzhi talks about, you know, where you're at today is because of where you were before, your soul. It's moved into the next, your next body or your next experience, and you know, you're given another opportunity to, you know, to be the good person, to be virtuous. So then you can move on, you know, eventually to heaven.
I was so happy to see this article there.
It gives me great optimism, hoping that a large amount of people will see this article.
I hope more people do read this, and I hope that I hope, you know, if there are people out there that, you know, that are leaning in the wrong direction or don't think there's hope in it, or you know, anything and everything's evil, I think they should read this, and I think that'll make a difference in their lives.
Wow, some very profound thoughts and interesting thoughts that people shared here, I have to say.
Yeah, it really was. And now on site, we're seeing a lot of people carrying banners with us, but we have Chinese characters, English characters, and many of people, they're out here raising awareness about the persecution of this spiritual practice. And so what we're going to see later on are many more people with carrying signs that read about the persecution. And let's talk about that for a moment. Levi, what led up to the ban in China?
Well, as we had mentioned, you know, it was very popular in the 90s. It's in every single park and all across China. So what really happened? The Chinese government did a survey in the end of 1998, and they found that there were 100 million people practicing. Well, at that time, there were 60 million members of the Communist Party. So the top leader saw that size difference and saw it as a threat. But we also have to understand that Falun Gong very much represents a renaissance, really, in China of spirituality, of traditional culture. For decades, that's been, the Communist Party has tried to stamp that out. And Falun Gong really was a reawakening of that. So the top leader in China, despite all the popularity, despite the benefits that people were getting from it, and despite actually that many senior leaders throughout China also embraced Falun Gong, he looked at those two factors and he said, crush it. And he was the man who actually gave the order in July of 1999.
Wow. And for those tuning in right now, today we're covering the commemoration of 24 years of brutal persecution of a spiritual group in China called Falun Gong. Now, before we dive deeper, we want to break down really quick the significance of this date, also tying in what Levi just mentioned, July 20th. Take a look.
In 1998, the Chinese government estimated that between 70 and 100 million people in China were practicing Falun Gong. It was the most popular practice of its kind in Chinese history, but the leader of the Communist Party wanted it gone. In the early hours of July 20th, 1999, public security bureaus carried out an organized operation to arrest the volunteer coordinators of Falun Gong practice sites throughout China. This was ordered by then Chinese leader Jiang Zemin. He declared that Falun Gong should be eliminated within 3 months. When his campaign failed to stop Falun Gong, he simply cracked down harder. Jiang Zemin implemented a strategy to eradicate Falun Gong practitioners by ruining their reputations, crushing them financially, and eliminating them physically. He also declared that beating them to death counts as suicide. From 1999 to the present, the Falun Gong website minghui.org has verified at least 5,000 cases of Falun Gong practitioners being persecuted to death. But some estimates suggest the true number of practitioners killed is actually several hundred thousand. In response to 24 years of brutal repression, Falun Gong practitioners inside and outside China have been unyielding in their efforts to expose the persecution through peaceful activities.
Now, we have been seeing two sets of numbers on site. If we can take a look, maybe one of them is passing by right now. Earlier, of course, it's 24 years of persecution. And another set of numbers that I saw is that Falun Gong has been spreading for 31 years. That's what it said in Mandarin Chinese, but just to give you guys a quick translation here. Now, I also understand that Falun Gong is an ancient practice. So how does these two information, how does it tie together?
So practices like Falun Gong have been passed down from teacher to disciple for thousands of years. And I think one of the incredible things that Mr. Li did is he took this practice and he made it public. And that's what happened in 1992, which of course is 31 years ago. So this practice was first made public in China.
That's very interesting. So that's good to know as well. Now let's take a look at what's happening over in Washington, D.C. For everybody tuning in right now, this is the parade to commemorate the persecution of Falun Gong in China. It's been ongoing, as mentioned, for 24 years. An entire generation of believers basically know nothing but oppression of their faith. And right now we are seeing people in yellow t-shirts that are holding wreaths or pictures of those that are deceased, I believe, and this because of the persecution of the CCP.
That's right. Those are the practitioners, the photos of the practitioners who have been persecuted to death. And if you have any questions, you out there in the audience, please feel free to ask away in our comment sections and we'll do our best to address those. You can leave us your questions in the comment sections of YouTube or Facebook or Epoch TV. And earlier, I had the opportunity to sit down with Florida resident Joe Yo, who is calling on Beijing to release his father after he was sentenced to 8 years behind bars. His crime? Practicing his spiritual belief, Falun Gong. Joe Yo lives a double life, writing software code by day, hosting a Chinese military YouTube channel by night. And now he's taking on a third role, trying to rescue his father from a Chinese detention center an ocean away. After a year and 4 months of imprisonment in a detention center, Joe's father, Zhou Deyong, was sentenced on April 20th to 8 years in prison for practicing the spiritual meditation discipline Falun Gong. Ever since his father's arrest, Joe has been living in a state of uncertainty, not being able to contact his father. The only information he does hear is from his father's lawyer.
Can you walk us through what happened with your father in China?
Oh, my father, he actually come to the States like 2019, and because of COVID, their flight back to China got canceled. So they stay here till August, till October, and then my father decided to go back to China because he want to take care of my grandparents. But sadly, my grandfather actually died last year. And I could now go to the funeral because if I return to China, I will be in jail. And my father could not make it either because my father was already in jail. So he went back to China on 2020 August, and he was arrested 2021 April, just half a year after he went back to China. My father's situation is very dire. So my father is 62 years old. He almost lost all his teeth. So he cannot eat meat, he cannot eat rice or vegetable. The only thing he can eat is the Chinese buns. So the Chinese bun is more like the bread. You dip the bread in the soup, make it very soft and eat it. That's the only thing my father can eat at this moment. He is 62 years old. And the mental health is something I'm I'm more concerned because he fall into a very strong argument with my lawyer for 2 hours. Well, he feels so unfair. He was sentenced to prison for 8 years. He feels so much anger, but the local police or the prosecutor, they never reply to my father. So the only one he can talk is my lawyer. So he holds so much anger that he just lashes it out. So I can understand it, but it makes me very concerned and worried about my father.
Your mom, she's been protesting outside of the Chinese consulate now for, I think it was 2 months, you said, every day, nonstop, from all day long. Why is she doing? So she's out there with the banner that says, "Free your father." So, she's doing this nonstop. This is a big issue to her.
Yes, my mom, she was a very brave woman. When she was in China, she went out to pass out the flyers almost every day, every week. I asked my mom, "Are you afraid?" My mom said, "Yes, of course, she is afraid, but she has to do that because there is many people who don't know the truth about persecution, who believe in what CCP says, so she had to do that." So when
has she been persecuted for doing this?
She was sent to the brainwashing center 10 years ago, or 40 days. Basically, he was passing out the flyers on the street. Someone called the police. Please come and take her to the brainwashing center.
When dealing with this, how has Falun Dafa given you guidance in terms of dealing with your father's situation?
You feel a lot of depressed and anger. It's just so unfair. 80 years. But as a Falun Gong practitioner, no matter how severe the persecution is, we have to be peaceful, not only with our behavior, but also with our mindset. My mother went to the consulate every day. He travels 3 hours a day. I don't think a lot of people can do that. I'm a YouTuber. I'm fighting on another front. I'm publishing 3 episodes every week, and I have another full-time job as a software engineer. So sometimes I feel overwhelmed, but that's the way forward, is doing everything peacefully with our full heart. Eventually, we will convey the message not only to the CCP, but to the people around the world that the good will prevail.
The good will prevail, he said. I think that's resonating with me. And his father is just one of the reasons why we are seeing masses of people, mostly dressed in blue and yellow, carrying different banners today in English, but as well as Mandarin Chinese. We will also be seeing a group of people with banners that echo a call for help. Right now, we are seeing these banners that echo a call for help to end the persecution of Falun Gong in China. And with this, we come to the main point of today's parade. 24 years ago today, the Communist Party of China announced that they would ban Falun Gong.
That's right. And here's what's significant. This was a 180-degree turn of events. Before this, there were millions of people practicing Falun Gong in parks, outside in the open in China. The CCP's state-controlled media even reported positively about Falun Gong.
Exactly, and you didn't just see millions of civilians. It was, in those videos, there were officials dressed in uniforms. So it seems like it was really all across the spectrum that people practiced Falun Gong. So how was this decision passed in China's governing body? Was there a consensus on this? How was this pushed through?
Yeah, I think this is a really important point, and one that the CCP tries to hide is that this, we talk about 100 million people, but it was everywhere. It was in military bases, it was in companies, farmers, housewives. I have a friend who was studying in Beijing, and there was 3 practice sites on his campus alone of professors and students. So it was really everywhere. I mean, it was sort of like baseball, apple pie, and church on Sunday in China in terms of the American, how rooted it was in the heartland. And so the decision was really by one man, and that decision really met with some opposition because some of the senior leaders in the Politburo had read the Falun Gong books, they had family members that were practicing, People have been practicing all over the place. And so there was while he did make that decision, and while that decision did have an immediate effect in terms of people being pulled into detention centers, literally pulled out of their beds in the middle of the night on July 20th, very early in the morning, it did take a while before all of the rank and file in all the provinces really came around to this idea that this thing that is heartland Chinese, Falun Gong, that everybody loves, we're going to now have to start sending them to prison camps, brainwashing centers, and things of that nature.
And if I may, I have another question on this. Because in the U.S., I think a little bit of, I would want you to go in a bit more detail, because in the U.S., it's hard for us to imagine if only one man decides that one day, you know, Christianity should be outlawed. It's very difficult for them to push this through. So how, I guess the question is, how exactly does China work as a country? How was that possible for one man to push this through?
Fear in the communist system. And let me explain what I mean by that. The communists have ruled China not because they're economic wizards or industrial wizards or have large governance experience and expertise. They're propagandists, and they run the country by fear. Every 10 years, there is a very violent campaign in China, whether it's the Cultural Revolution or all the different anti-5 campaign or the campaign against intellectuals. And so the Chinese people have come to realize that when a new campaign comes, they better duck their head down and stay quiet, or they're going to be next. So it creates a lot of fear. So when they started the persecution of Falun Gong, it wasn't something that completely was unrecognizable to the Chinese people. They saw, uh-oh, here comes another campaign. We either get out of the way or we're going to get caught up in it. That fear can mobilize a lot of people to do really terrible things. So that's the first thing. And the second reason is really the communist system. Jiang Zemin was the general secretary of the Communist Party. That is the most powerful position in China. And ultimately, he has the final say for things like this. He might have to, and did have to, do some convincing, do a lot of bribery, a lot of bringing in his own people, firing people that weren't cooperating with him. But he ultimately is the most powerful person in the country. Those two things together, the fear and the communist system, ultimately made it possible for this persecution campaign to get off the ground.
Wow. And so many of these campaigns that have taken place in the past, a lot of them they were able to squash whoever they were suppressing within a matter of days, from what I've observed. But Falun Gong, it's gone on. The practice has not been squashed. It's been 24 years of persecution. Why is that different?
Faith. I mean, it's really that simple. I mean, if you look at what drives the Falun Gong practitioners in China to peacefully resist this persecution, to not take up arms, to do it peacefully, and yet not give up their faith. And in many cases, the practice continues to spread. It's really the strength of their faith. They see something, you know, again, this is not it's not a dogmatic thing or a structural thing. It's something that's very close to the human heart. So each person who practices Falun Gong says, this thing is so good. Look what it's done to my life. Look what it's done to my family. That creates a lot of impetus to not give it up, even when you're faced with the horrors of what the CCP is trying to dole out. So it really comes down to that faith. That's really driving it all.
Well, thank you for that, Levi.
Now let's take a look at what's going on live on side. We want to bring back Melina Weisskopf, a reporter at this point. She is right there. Melina.
All right, I'm here with Arthur, who's been a Falun Dafa practitioner for 27 years. Arthur, you met face-to-face with this persecution in China. Tell us what that experience was like.
Yes, after the persecution started in 1999, at the time I was a high school graduate, and I was harassed and detained a few times. And in 2000, I was thrown into the labor camp just because I telling people the truth about Falun Dafa. And I was tortured, beaten, almost to death in the labor camp. And later, I was also deprived of the rights for further education, other, basic rights. And finally, I'm lucky I escaped to the U.S. So one time in the labor camp in Beijing, about 5 or 6 police just tortured me, and a few other practitioners together used 5 or 6 the high voltage electrical batons to beat me. I lost my consciousness, So my cheeks, my neck, my arms are all like burned. Yes.
So, you know, even at a young age, you experienced this torture, and it must have been very difficult for you. But Arthur, why was it so important for you to hold on to this belief?
So I think it's very natural to unhold the truth. So because Falun Dafa's principles are truthfulness, compassion, forbearance, I believe that's the best. It's the universal values, no matter what's the religious background. Actually, in the beginning of the persecution, it was so shocking because, well, we just practice meditation. We try to do our best to be a good person, to look inward in the disputes, and just consider others first, right? And do nothing bad. So I think it's just like the persecution happened in history, like the persecutions of Christians happened 2,000 years ago. So even the persecutions lasted over 300 years. They never give up. So it's the same.
Thank you so much for sharing. We appreciate it.
Wow, what a tragic story to hear from him, from Arthur. And now let's take a look on site and see what's going on with the parade. And we can see pictures of people holding banners saying,
"Help stop the persecution of Falun Gong." And again, they're calling for help. And I'm going to come in here because we see quite a bit of Mandarin Chinese. That's because a lot of them are coming from China or sending a message to China in a country that is free, because this is something they are not able to say in China.
That's right. Yeah, they saying the words Falun Dafa is good in China may get you arrested. So, Levi, I want to ask you about the prisons in China. How many people are still detained, and give us a look on what it's like to be inside one of these cells.
Numbers are really hard to pinpoint, but there's a couple data points we could look at and get a fairly clear sense of what's going on. So we have a lot of former detainees that come out of China and that various journalists and human rights workers have debriefed and kind of talked about. And one of the things they say is that in many cases in a lot of these prisons, Falun Gong consists of the majority of the people detained in that facility. So if you look at some of the other estimates about how many people are being detained, for example, when the labor camps were in place, the Duihua Foundation and other sort of groups looked at that. It looks like in most years, it was in excess of 500,000 people. And so if you look over the last 20 years or 24 years, we're talking easily several millions of people have been at one point in time in a labor camp, a detention center, or a brainwashing center. Wow. Now, to your first question about what does that really look like, I mean, people have to understand that the persecution of Falun Gong is about a forcible reprogramming of your heart and mind to give up your faith and follow the CCP. And usually that's done through psychological torture and physical torture. That's not the goal for other sort of quote-unquote criminals. If you stole something or extortion and you're in prison for that, that's it. You're just incarcerated. So it's not surprising that almost all of the people we interview coming out of these places say that Falun Gong receives the worst treatment, because they're the ones where detention is just stage one. The real goal is to get them to give up their faith, and the police are incentivized monetarily or via promotions to get people to give up their belief. So once they're incarcerated or once they're detained, that's when a lot of the real horrors begin.
Why? Why is faith not? Why don't they like to see faith inside China?
Faith is perhaps more than anything else in the CCP's mind the biggest challenge to their authority. Because what is their authority? Again, we're not talking about government wizards or economic wizards or industrial wizards. These are people who know how to seize power via propaganda and hold on to it. So if you have a faith, a belief that they do not control, a belief that doesn't acknowledge them as the foremost power in your life, that is the biggest challenge in their minds to their power.
It makes a lot of sense. So they're not, it's a threat because then they do not live by the CCP's ideologies and they have an alternative. I am seeing online that we have quite a few audience questions at this point. So I'm going to go ahead and toss you one, Levi. Sure. Dolly asks, does Falun Gong include praying for one another?
That's an interesting question. Generally, yes, it does. And not only that, I mean, there are so many stories out of China of when a practitioner might get arrested or held in a prison camp, the rallying that happens around the Falun Gong community, and in many cases beyond the Falun Gong community, to rescue that person. And sometimes it's getting the phone number of the prison camp out to human rights workers abroad, and they start calling the prison camp. So imagine that, you're a police officer, you just pulled in a Falun Gong practitioner, you might be torturing them, and someone calls you from Missouri or Paris, France, and says, I know what you're doing. There's this tremendous rallying around trying to free the practitioners, but that does, based on their faith, it does also include prayer.
Interesting.
We have another question from an audience member, URB Hippie 777 Chavez Hoover. He'd like to know where they practice this in California. He'd like to join.
So in the United States, like over 100 countries around the world, all the practice sites where you can go and learn the exercises or study the books with other people are run by volunteers, and they're completely for free. You can go to the website. The main website of the practice is falundafa.org, and that has a section where it lists all these volunteer practice sites. So you go into your country, in your state, in your city, and you'll find a phone number of a volunteer.
Wow, yeah, we're just seeing this big banner coming up here saying Falun Dafa around the world. So it really seems like Falun Dafa is around the world. I think that maybe answers JS's question as well, which says, how do you find the spiritual meditation movements? So the answer to that is
on the website.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's something that I think gets lost in all the horrific things that are happening in China, is that Falun Gong, at this point, 100 countries, we get pictures of people doing exercises in Togo, Africa, Peru. You know, it's really, I mean, there's huge groups. They introduce it in the school systems in India and in Taiwan. And so it really is a global phenomenon at this point.
We have another question before we are moving on. My friend Grizzly is his name. How do we stop this, his or her name, how do we stop this horrific genocide? Perhaps what Trump suggests may work, exorbitant tariffs on the imports of China. Maybe this, I'm not sure if this is quite in your expertise spectrum as the expert for Falun Gong, but I thought I'd come up with it anyway.
Well, I mean, I don't know as much of the economic dynamics. I'm sure a lot of my friends in the Chinese community, dissident community, not just Falun Gong, by the way, others in the Chinese dissident community did see tariffs and anything that's got teeth going against the CCP as something being effective, because a lot of the foreign investment into China is the economic engine that drives the persecution. But I'd also say don't just do that. Those sanctions that countries do against Chinese officials that persecute Falun Gong, what people don't realize is that news gets into China via the large-scale underground print shops that I think we'll talk about in a minute, and that gets out into the Chinese populace, and suddenly they read, the U.S. government is sanctioning our officials because they persecute Falun Gong. That's completely against the state-run narrative. It has a huge impact in China.
And we're seeing a lot of blue and yellow on screen. Levi, are these the signature colors of Falun Dafa?
Well, a little story. It's a little bit accidental, somewhat. When Jiang Zemin started the persecution and he came to New York, it was about 6 months in. A large group of volunteers, we were all huddled in an apartment in New York City, and we wanted to be visible so that Jiang Zemin could see that Falun Gong was in New York and we understood what he was doing. We needed something that would stand out, hence the yellow.
It works.
Yeah.
All right, to the prior question, I think we will touch on that again, what we can do to actually help. But I also want to bring in one more question that I had, is because I have people, I've heard people calling this the hidden Holocaust. A lot of these comparisons were drawn, and so we're really, as we're seeing right now, we're seeing a lot of people inside, as you mentioned, as well as outside of China, trying to break through the type of propaganda and disinformation and really trying to point out what really is happening. So if this is history repeating itself, I may want to add that this really is very significant today, this parade. But first, I think there is just very few things you can compare to the Holocaust. And frankly, it's been misused recently. So what justifies this comparison to you?
I think the most comprehensive and accurate assessment I've seen was written by some academics, which called the persecution of Falun Gong a cold genocide. And what they mean by that is a cold genocide is basically a genocide that fits all the parameters of a genocide, but it's multidimensional, it's subtle, and it's normalized. Meaning, unlike in the Holocaust, where the gas chambers were the main mechanism, or in Rwanda, where unfortunately it was a large cache of machetes, in Falun Gong, it's multifaceted. And the goal is not necessarily to kill every single body. The goal is to forcibly reprogram the heart and the mind. But by doing that, they've stated this, the CCP gentlemen have said this very clearly, they want to eradicate Falun Gong from the face of the earth. That is a genocidal statement. The ways in which they do it fit this definition of cold genocide of using torture, using brainwashing, and other high-pressure techniques to have everybody give up their faith.
That's horrifying. But now we turn to Yanya Kellick, host of American Thought Leaders. He sat down with one of the Falun Gong practitioners who was imprisoned. She shared her heartbreaking story with him. Take a look.
I remember my first experience being physically tortured was in a detention center in my city, Guangzhou City, the Tianhe Detention Center. I was forced to have a high-density salt torture, which seems very weird, right? But that torture actually is that I was forced to have this like a high-density water, high-density salt by, 5 big, large male detainees putting me down on the floor, and they cut this bottle, water bottle in half as a funnel, and they cover my eyes with a very dirty towels used to wipe the floor. And then they shove this 1 pound bag of the salt with just a little bit water in it, and shove this opening of the bottle and trying to pry my mouth open. And then I feel like, the salt is all over my nose, my eyes, and I feel really, really hot pain. It's very painful. And at the same time that they use a stick to scratch my feet so that I will gasp. And so all this salt will put it into my throat, my stomach. So it's really, really painful. So I couldn't breathe. I struggle to fight against this pain, but at the same time that I feel that I'm going to die.
Horrific that she was also able to recall all this in so much detail. We're here following the parade to commemorate 24 years of terrible persecution of Falun Gong in China. The organizers are expecting thousands of participants this year. This parade today started in front of the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. Let's take a look at the upcoming banners. We are seeing a banner that reads, "Help stop the persecution of Falun Gong." So they're calling for help out here in the U.S. Here we go. Here's a question for you, Levi. What kind of help are they asking for? How can we help?
There's a number of things you can do. First of all, at the federal level, there are 2 bills before our Congress, one against forced organ harvesting, one generally to protect Falun Gong. Get on the phone to your representatives and say, support those bills. Call the White House. This administration, the last administration, are the ones who sanctioned Chinese officials for the persecution of Falun Gong. Again, that has ripple effects in China. It's very helpful. But also, as important, I should say, share this information on social media. I know that sounds sort of trite and simplistic, but a lot of the problems that have come up, not just the persecution of Falun Gong, but all the stuff that the CCP is doing, has come from ignorance. People not knowing what is the nature of this thing and what does it really, what danger does it really serve. Share this stuff, raise the awareness here, and if you really want to get involved, here's an idea. We have on our website several family rescue cases. These are people who live in the United States, a mom, a brother or something is imprisoned in China. There are the addresses of those prison camps. There's a phone number. Write to them. Imagine that if you're sitting in a prison camp and you've been there for a year or two and you get letters from the United States saying, we're watching you, we understand, we're with you. That not only helps the prisoner, it definitely sends a strong message to the people running the prison.
Gotcha.
And we hear a lot about the Uyghurs and Tibetans in the mainstream media, but rarely do we hear about Falun Gong. Why is that?
We don't hear, well, first I would say it's important to know that it wasn't always that way. For the first few years of the persecution, the Falun Gong was on the front pages. It was on the front page of the New York Times 5 times in 1999. The Washington Post had a great piece really divulging how this is not just rogue police officers. This is top down, you must use torture to break Falun Gong. The Wall Street Journal won the Pulitzer Prize in the year 2000. They were the first ones that divulged that people were indeed being held and tortured and killed around China for Falun Gong. However, in around 2002, 2003, things went very silent. And that coincides exactly with the political and economic rise of the CCP on the world stage. And what we've seen since then is, yes, silence, but there's been many cases, almost every year, of a documentary that someone's going to do and that gets canceled, or an interview someone's going to do and that gets canceled. So there is a large amount of pressure on our media establishment not to talk about this, because this is the third rail issue.
Wow.
And so, because in my research I saw that the CCP actually, concerning the other faiths like house Christians and faiths like that, they are actually going into those churches and they are hanging up portraits of Xi Jinping, the state leader, and in return let them exist, right? So why isn't that something that is done with Falun Gong as well? Why is this group just being treated so radically?
In the CCP's mind, Falun Gong is an existential threat. They don't want bad news written about the Uyghurs or the Hong Kongers. CCP wants to look good, but it's not a threat to their regime. They see Falun Gong as a third rail issue for a few reasons. One, it's not isolated to one region or one ethnic group. When they went after Falun Gong, they went after all of Chinese society at every level. And with a scope and scale of atrocities that at this point, if that were exposed fully, they feel that would bring the regime down. And so they think of it as an existential threat from that perspective. But there's another thing. Tens of millions of Falun Gong practitioners in China are running basically citizen journalism network inside China, creating pamphlets and leaflets and telling everybody about what's really happening to them, what the true history of the CCP. And outside China, if you look at the Falun Gong diaspora and the various Western Falun Gong practitioners that are helping, it is collectively the single largest whistleblower of the crimes of the CCP. So when the CCP looks at Falun Gong, they see existential threat if their crimes are revealed to the world, and they see the single largest whistleblower that's telling the world about all their dirty laundry. That's why they're not going to make any overtures to even pretend that they support Falun Gong. The easiest way for the last 24 years, if you want to end a meeting with a Chinese official, is you bring up Falun Gong in the meeting, meeting's over.
Wow. We'd like to dive into this more, but now we'll hear from Melina Wisecup in the nation's capital. She's interviewing participants in the parade. Let's go to that.
All right, I'm here with Li Jing, who's a 39-year-old Falun Dafa practitioner. She's been practicing since she was 13. Your mom was persecuted twice. She went to jail. Tell us about your experience during that time.
Yes, so my mom was arrested 2 times. The first time was in 2015. By that time, I was 20 years old. And the police officers, they threatened me. And if my mom doesn't give up practicing Falun Gong, they will kick me out from my college. So scary, very pressured, yeah. And the second time was in 2015. My mom was stopped at the train station, and she wiped her ID and was found she is a practitioner. And she was arrested immediately and sent to the detention center. By that time, I lost contact with my mom for 2 weeks. And I didn't know where she was, so worried and scared, and I couldn't go to sleep, crying day and night. Later, I found that she was tortured in the detention center. No sleep, bad food, didn't have shower. So after that, she was sent to hospital. Yeah.
And then you had mentioned that you risked being kicked out of your college. So how was it growing up in China doing this practice?
Yeah, under pressure somehow. Because the CCP, Chinese Communist Party's propaganda, my friends' parents told their children to keep away from me. So I felt isolated. Even though I know Falun Gong is righteous, I had to hide it from my new friends. And in 2019, I went to renew my passport and didn't give me.
So they confiscated your passport. That's crazy. And you had mentioned why you want to share this story with people today. Why do you believe it's the right thing to do for you?
Yeah, because I believe that truthfulness, compassion, tolerance, fundamental value leads to people to have a good life. And that's why I'm always positive, kind to people. Yeah, I want to tell people the truth because people deserve the truth. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Li Jing.
And we have another first-hand account here today. Sean Lin is a Falun Gong practitioner, and not only is he witnessing the persecution that's happening now, he was there during the Tiananmen massacre. Sean, let's start with your experience at Tiananmen Square as a student in 1989. How was that like?
Yeah, I was on the Tiananmen Square on the night of the massacre. And fortunately, I withdrew with the last group of students from the Tiananmen Square. But even at the moment that we withdrew from the Tiananmen Square, the People Liberation Army already opened fire. So you can hear the gunshot hitting the monuments. And also on our way back to Tsinghua University, we actually encountered the PLA's tanks. And I personally witnessed the tank rolling over students' head. It was a terrible thing. It was my first time. It was my first time seeing people's skull totally being flattened like a piece of paper on the ground. It was totally horrifying. And the soldiers also came out of the tank, chasing the students, throwing the tear gas. So we have to hide in civilians' houses. And it was a nightmare. Yeah, it's a thing I never will forget.
Yeah, horrifying scenes. And Jiang Zemin, let's talk about that. Can you tell me more about his role in this massacre, and the other one, of course, being the Falun Gong persecution?
Yeah, so it was clear that Jiang Zemin actually came into power after the Tiananmen Square massacre, and he was the one actually very actively engaging in the crackdown policy in Shanghai. And by using a hardline policy against students, he actually won the favor of Chinese Communist Party elites. So he was chosen as a leader. So basically, he came into power with the students' blood in his hands. And then in 1999, Jiang Zemin further launched the crackdown against Falun Gong because Falun Gong was even bigger than the Communist Party by the 1999.
Right, and then it impacted you. You were also detained after you started practice in Falun Gong. So what happened there?
Yeah, so I started to practice Falun Gong in the United States. And so when the persecution of Falun Gong started, I actually actively joined some human rights campaign in Washington, D.C. as well in United Nations. So I didn't know my name was already on the blacklist of the Chinese government. So in year 2000, when I went back to China, because my father passed away, but at the custom of Fuzhou Airport, I was immediately arrested together with my wife, Xiaohua Du. And so at the time, we were immediately put into detention center. And so for several days, and then later on, we were released for house arrest. So we were forced to go to police stations to accept interrogations every couple of days. And so they would try to find out how the Falun Gong was organized, how the Falun Gong's practitioners can get in such large quantities to, protest in national capital in the United States. And then the United States Department of State wrote a letter to China's Foreign Affairs Office, and they were really shocked. And because we just like two graduate students, we're nobody, and they really didn't realize that actually U.S. government want us to be released and returned to the United States to continue our study. And then China's Public Security Bureau finally got a notice from the central government. So after 2 months of these hassles, so we were eventually released back to the United States. So we were actually the first couple that was successfully rescued by the United States government, as well as people's rescue campaigns in Alabama and Georgia.
Well, I'm glad that your story found this type of ending, and I'm able to speak to you today. So thanks so much for sharing your story today, Sean Lin.
Thank you very much.
Well, and I think what part of what he said really ties into what you mentioned earlier, that this fear is ingrained into Chinese people's being, because somebody like Sean that was there during the Tiananmen massacre and really saw somebody's skull crushed, that's incredible. Now, also about the latter part, Sean went back to China in the year 2000. So that's near the beginning of the persecution when it started. So could this be a possible explanation as of why his treatment was so different than what we hear nowadays?
Yeah, I mean, there could be a couple scenarios. I mean, one is that, I mean, clearly he was from the U.S. and they were trying to get information out of him. And one, they have good cop, bad cop scenarios. There's different ways to try and do that. They call it coming down to this police station and having tea with them. That's the sort of vernacular of it. So it could just been something trying to get information from them. It could also be that, again, in the year 2000, certainly the persecution was in high order. Certainly there was a lot of atrocities going on, but there's probably still some people going, I don't agree with this. And perhaps some of those people are in that police station, other police stations, because it took a while before Jiang Zemin was really able to solidify rank and file, all provinces around China. I also think it played a real factor that the U.S. government was involved, especially early back then, where I think that would really freak out Chinese police and officials to have suddenly the U.S. government is asking about these two graduate students. I could imagine a panic situation. Let's just get them out of here. Yeah.
Interesting. Now, often there is one particular agency that's the source of all these terrible stories that we have just heard, and that's what's called the 610 office. Here's what that is. Take a look.
On June 10th, 1999, the leader of the Chinese Communist Party created a group for handling the Falun Gong problem. That group created what came to be known as the 610 office, named for the date of its establishment. Since then, the 610 office has overseen China's nationwide persecution of Falun Gong. The 610 office exists above Chinese law. Despite having no legal mandate, it's been given enormous financial resources. Reuters has compared the 610 office to the Nazi Gestapo, or secret police. The 610 office has deep ties to the Chinese police, labor camps, state-run media, the court system, schools and universities, and even Chinese embassies around the world, directing them to carry out the Communist Party's persecution of Falun Gong. For nearly 24 years, the 610 office has been responsible for the mass surveillance, arrest, detention, and torture of millions of Falun Gong practitioners in China. The United States Congress and other members of the international community have repeatedly demanded that the Chinese government put an end to the 610 office.
First, let's start with when the 610 office was established. Jiang Zemin ordered the eradication of Falun Gong. Levi, what did this order mean and why then?
Well, it was really in April that he started thinking about this, sent letters to other people saying we're going to crack down on them. But June 10th, which is where 610 gets its name, is the date that he gave the order to form this office. And again, as the video just showed, it's important to understand that this is a extra-legal paramilitary group that has jurisdiction over the entire security apparatus throughout China and reports directly back to the Politburo, specifically Jiang Zemin. That was critical because, again, Falun Gong was widely applauded and welcomed in China. And so rather than relying solely on the rank and file of existing security, he needed another group that would report directly to him that would do all the dirty work of stamping out Falun Gong.
And with 100 million people practicing, how would they know who's a Falun Gong practitioner and how would they find them?
Falun Gong, by its nature, is very, very open. And so certainly before the persecution, you know, like in all other countries, if you wanted to learn the practice, there were just volunteers all over the country and openly give out their names and numbers. And if you want to learn the practice, come down to the park, I'll teach you, all for free. So that was one reason. The second reason is even after the persecution first started, Falun Gong continued to be very open because I'd say a vast majority of Falun Gong practitioners in China for quite a while felt that this must have been just some tragic mistake. How could something heartland Chinese so good, that's beneficial, that even the number 2 person in the Chinese government, Zhu Rongji at the time, had openly praised, how could the government be going after this? They couldn't believe it. And so the first year or two of the persecution, Falun Gong practitioners were openly going to appeals offices all around the country, openly going to Tiananmen Square, giving their name, giving their number, because they thought this was all just a very big, big mistake.
And the 610 office was officially disbanded along with the labor camps. Did that lessen the persecution of the Falun Gong?
Not that we can see, really. What they really did is they took the personnel and the functions those personnel performed and they moved them around into a couple of other agencies. But those people are still there and they're still doing that kind of work. They had to they felt they had to dissolve the official structure of 610 because of all the international scrutiny it was getting.
And one last question before we move on here, because the news we heard recently about the covert police stations, are they tied into the 610 offices? Are they connected?
Well, they're certainly connected in that the 610 office, the function of it, the scope of its work was not limited to China's borders. They were also doing, you know, there was an official, a 610 official actually, that defected some years ago from Tianjin, China, northeast China, and he was divulging that these databases of information on Falun Gong practitioners in China, well, they're also collecting those on Falun Gong practitioners all around the world. And so 610 was coordinating and working on transnational repression, going after Falun Gong in the United States and other countries. It certainly wasn't the only thing. There are other cities and provinces that were coordinating these transnational repression efforts against Falun Gong in many other countries, but 610 was a part of that for sure.
I see.
Well, thank you for that insight, Levi. And now we welcome to our program Ambassador Sam Brownback, former U.S. Ambassador at Large for International Religious Freedom. Due to his great work, he knows about the crimes against humanity committed by the CCP. Ambassador Sam Brownback, thank you so much for joining us. It's great to have you on the program.
My pleasure to join you and hopefully shed some light on a really bad situation in China.
And I'd like to ask you about the CCP's persecution of their own people of faith. Why has the Chinese Communist Party taken Falun Gong as its enemy?
They see him as a threat. The CCP is about control. It's about power. It's atheistic, of course, and so there can be no power higher than the government. And what they see is they've observed other regimes like themselves fall around the world, that it's usually a religious group or a religious entity that's at the root and the organization of taking down a government like the CCP. And so they go at religious groups with a ferocity, with a determination that is unmatched going towards anybody else, and particularly, as I'd mentioned earlier to you, groups like Falun Gong are threatening to them.
And you've said before that the CCP takes religion, or faith rather, as its enemy, or it's declared war on faith. Why do you say that?
Because that's the only institution that can stand up to them. There's no other structure left in China that has the capacity to stand up to the CCP or the organization or the adherents or the drive. And people of faith are willing to die for their faith. They're not willing to die for the CCP. They're willing to die fighting the CCP for their faith. And that really threatens a communist party like the CCP and then they spread out. They've used technology to control religions, and then they send their technology and their systems to other controlling autocratic regimes to use it there to control religion in those countries.
And now we hear a lot about the Uyghurs, especially in our mainstream media, but we don't hear very much about Falun Gong. It seems like a no-go topic when it's brought up by the CCP. It's never brought up by the CCP. Why is the persecution of Falun Gong so unique in that way?
Oh, there's a number of reasons. The malice with which the CCP has treated the Falun Gong is unmatched. Things like forced organ harvesting of Falun Gong members, those are things that would make a medieval executioner blush. And yet the Chinese Communist Party does it to Falun Gong members. And I think what's particularly threatening to the Chinese communists about Falun Gong is it's much of a domestic movement. It doesn't have a hierarchy or structure. It doesn't have a bunch of buildings that they can control or watch. And it's organic. It comes up and it can grow, and they don't control it, and they can't control it, and it can move. It at one point marched on Beijing, and they didn't even know it was happening, and that is particularly threatening to the CCP's control.
Ambassador Sam Brownback, thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure.
Well known in her community, a Falun Gong practitioner named Gao Rongrong was one of the labor camp victims. Levi, tell us about Gao Rongrong.
For tragic reasons, she really became the face of the persecution, at least the torture aspect of it, for many years. She was an accountant at an arts college, a young accountant at an arts college in China. In 2003, she was picked up because she's a practitioner. In 2004, it came to light that she was tortured fairly badly, particularly with electric batons all about the face and neck. During that torture session, someone she was with actually, who was being tortured the same way, had a heart attack, and that's the only reason it stopped. She had a chance to try and escape. She jumped out of, I think, a second floor window, broke her leg and hip, and then was hospitalized. When she was hospitalized, her sisters were able to come in, and they snuck in a camera. And this is one of the very first times we saw photographic and even video proof of a torture victim from Falun Gong in China. So they got pictures of her out, they got a short video of her out, and her story really for a year or two really became the symbol because it showed in crystal clarity exactly what was happening to the Falun Gong in China.
Well, thank you, Levi. And out of respect for her and our audience, we will not show the disturbing video clip of her in her last moments. There are extremely graphic scenes that show the brutality she suffered moments before her death. On her face, you can see the violent electric shock marks. Gao Rongrong had some profound last words she wanted to capture to let the world know about the brutality suffered by the CCP. So to watch that video, you can go to faluninfo.net.
That's right, and on top of that, besides Gao Rongrong, there have been occasions where people in the United States have found hidden messages in clothes or toys that call for help. A documentary called Letter from Ma Sanjia actually tells one of those stories from one of those letters. The Falun Gong practitioner who wrote that letter shares about what he endured in that film, and his words describe an absolutely horrible situation. It just makes you wonder how many more people have actually suffered this and are still suffering in these conditions. Now, Levi, that brings me to you. Do you have an estimate of how many Falun Gong adherents and are in those labor camps, and how many more are put there every year?
Yeah, again, it's very tough to get exact current numbers. We know, again, for most years, certainly when the labor camp system was still very active, it was in excess of 500,000 at any given time, and that was true for many, many years. So looking back at all the years, the last 24 years, the total number that people have been pulled into some form of detention, millions.
Wow.
Yeah.
Now, I also want to bring in some more recent events really quick because these influencers were invited to a Shein factory. That's a clothing shop out of China. And this was a PR stunt that really backfired in the media in the US. So do you think maybe that this is an indication of what we're seeing also with more and more CCP news coming out currently in the US? Is this maybe an indication that the image that China is trying to preserve is slowly crumbling?
And also they've always fumbled heavily, even every time they try and do one of these PR stunts. I mean, that backfired, the one you're talking about backfired very quickly. They've done other things like that. They've pulled Western, I remember several years ago, many years ago, they pulled a bunch of Western journalists to go to one of the notorious labor camps to show how benevolent it is and how, you know, well people were treated. And right away, the Western journalists realized this entire thing was staged. For example, everybody was in a uniform where the name of the labor camp, their name was all written in English. That doesn't make any sense. And of course, everybody, and what was made it more clear is everybody had the same story. They're being treated well, everything's fine. If you go to any prison, even in America or in the Western countries, you're gonna find some people that are grumpy about something. And this one, everybody was fine. It was clearly a horribly staged PR attempt, and they do this quite often. Yeah.
Yeah, it sounds like a common tactic.
Yeah.
And now we welcome to the program a survivor of Mao's Cultural Revolution, Lily Tong Williams. She's a congressional candidate for New Hampshire, to get her take on the CCP's human rights violations. Lily Tong Williams, welcome to the show. It's great to have you on.
Thank you for having me today.
You came to from China to the U.S. In the 80s, and for those who have never lived in a communist country, can you tell us what it's like there?
Well, that the communists don't like religious freedom. Ever since I was a little girl, we were raised as a Buddhist, but we were afraid to tell people we believe in Buddhism. We only were allowed to believe in communism and believe Chairman Mao as the only supreme leader or godlike leader. So I totally bought into that indoctrination, and I told my mom that time, it's like don't say Buddha bless me anymore, because you need to believe the party. And now I realize that after I come to this country, my whole life, 24 years, actually were indoctrinated, and whatever government told me, most of them are total lies. And the people need to understand the religious persecution is continuing today under Xi Jinping's leadership, talking about cultural genocide in Uyghur area, Xinjiang, and Tibet, and even Inner Mongolia, and of course continuously persecution of Falun Gong practitioners. Even though some religions and churches are allowed, like a Catholic church and some Mormon church, but they have to understand those are always government blessings. You need to get a state license, and you leaders need to be approved by the Communist Party.
And as far as the persecutions going on today in China, including Falun Gong and the Uyghurs, and how is this manifestation of the nature of the Chinese Communist Party?
Well, as I said, they want you to believe in them, their religion, their evil ideology they're trying to sell to the world right now. It's a socialism with China characteristics. It's a communism. It's a censorship. It's like abuse of human rights. And they're here too. They're in the United States, continue to harass and threaten people, like Falun Gong practitioners like me, who is running for Congress as dissident, anti-CCP, and we just have to not to be silenced. We're not going to be canceled until we cancel ourselves. So I applaud to the people in this country, especially Falun Gong practitioners. Every year they have events, every year, and they continue to use the media, use social media to speak the truth and to promote really compassion and truthfulness and tolerance.
Thank you, Lily Tong Williams. Now, to dive deeper into the issue of the CCP's forced organ harvesting, we welcome to the program Dr. G. Weldon Gilcrease, the Deputy Director of Doctors Against Forced Organ Harvesting. Dr. G. Weldon Gilcrease, Deputy Director of Doctors Against Forced Organ Harvesting, welcome to the program. It's great to have you on.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Can you briefly tell us about your organization and how it formed?
Yeah, so Doctors Against Forced Organ Harvesting, this was first developed in 2007 after credible evidence had come out that the Chinese Communist Party had orchestrated the killing of innocent prisoners of conscience for organ transplant after David Matus and David Kilgore published their report in 2006 and then early 2007. So the organization was started with really the intent of trying to raise awareness around this horrific abuse of medical ethics.
And can you explain China's organ tourism and the regime's on-demand supply of organs?
Yeah, so what we saw in the early 2000s, so China had no organ transplantation donation system or distribution system. And you see this explosion of organs. And in fact, if you look at websites from the early 2000s in Chinese transplant hospitals, there were costs of organs, and then there were guarantees of, for example, a liver transplant was guaranteed within 2 weeks. And so this really ties into the question of organ tourism. Who was paying for these organs? Where were all of these organs coming from? In a country, one piece of data that's Chinese data was that before 1999, the number of liver transplants that China was doing yearly was about 15 to 20 per year. So it's a very low number. And then all of a sudden in the early 2000s, you have this explosion of transplants where they're doing as many as 3,000 liver transplants in a single year. And so I think from about 2001 to 2005 and 2006, the question was, where are these organs coming from and who's receiving these organs?
And 24 years ago, on July 20th, it marks the beginning of the persecution of Falun Gong. Can you talk about that and how it relates to organ harvesting?
Yeah, you really can't talk about forced organ harvesting without talking about the crackdown by Jiang Zemin and the Communist Party on Falun Gong practitioners. So I think if you look at the story of forced organ harvesting, it doesn't happen without looking at the story of the persecution of Falun Gong practitioners in China. So on July 20th of 1999, Jiang Zemin cracked down on Falun Gong and essentially illegally banned the practice within China. And then a year to 2 years after that, that's when you see this explosion of transplant activity within China. And so I think one important fact to know is that the Chinese government's estimates are that there were about 70 million to 100 million people practicing Falun Gong in China in the late 90s. And so when Zemin and the Chinese Communist Party started cracking down on practitioners, the estimate is that there were about 450,000 to 1 million Falun Gong practitioners in labor camps, detention centers, prisons that were scattered geographically throughout China. And so what happens then is that there's this connection between an erosion of medical ethics, a totalitarian system in the Chinese Communist Party that really has has the Chinese medical system in its grips, and then using Falun Gong practitioners that are in detention centers, labor camps, that are undergoing these unusual medical exams and blood tests, but they become the de facto organ bank for China's explosion in transplant activity.
Well, Dr. G. Weldon Gilcrease, thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me.
And now, Levi, we spoke about propaganda earlier, and I think there's a big elephant in the room when it comes to the fact that media has been reporting on Falun Gong as being dangerous for its beliefs. What can you say about that?
Well, I think it's important to look at the origin of that narrative. So what happened when the persecution first started is they had no reason. In fact, just days, I think, after the persecution started, Ted Koppel, who was running the Nightline, which is the most popular news program at that time in this nation, brought on a senior Chinese official and a Falun Gong representative, and he asked him point blank, why are you doing this to Falun Gong? The senior official sort of like started to move around in his chair. It's like, they're disturbing traffic and disrupting social order. And Ted Koppel was like, what? That's your reason? And they didn't have much of a better reason for months after that. It wasn't until October of 1999 that, unfortunately from what we hear, with the help of a Western PR firm, that the CCP decided to start labeling Falun Gong a cult, because they understood that's a hot button issue in America. No one likes cults. No one's going to go to bat for cults. nobody knows what Falun Gong is in the West. That's a vacuum. If they could fill that vacuum with this narrative that this is a cult, that this is a dangerous group, they could really stave off what would have been a lot of criticism coming at them. And that's where that cult narrative started. And it really has been pushed by the CCP for 24 years.
And just before we move on here, I want to spend a few more seconds before we move on. So how is it happening right now? Like, how do they still have that grip on the news media? Why are we still...
There's a narrative in the news media that it's associated with politics, political affiliations.
So one of the things the CCP is adept at is not only propaganda, but attuning that or fine-tuning that propaganda to the target audience. And in this particular case, the U.S. So let's look at two examples. In one case, in recent years, like when George Floyd was killed here in this country, racism really flared up as a hot-button issue. What you started to see, now they'd always talked about this, but what you started to see more and more in CCP propaganda, pushing the idea that Falun Gong is racist because they prohibit interracial marriage. Now, I'm in an interracial marriage. I know a whole lot of Falun Gong people that are in interracial marriages. It had no basis in reality, but the CCP didn't care. What they cared about is that's a narrative they could try and spin and make it stick here in the United States. So that's one example that they use. Another example I'd give you is in recent years, there's been this narrative that Falun Gong is a right-wing group, right? Well, where does that come from? Well, that one's a little bit more complicated in that during the Trump years when the trade war was going on, there was a lot of Chinese dissidents, not just Falun Gong, but the Chinese dissident community at large was looking at that trade war going, you know what, whether they liked Trump or not, they looked at that and they said, you know what, this is going to work. This is going to stave off, it's going to really hamper the CCP's tyranny. I approve of this. Well, you go into the hypertension of the political environment at that point, a lot of these Chinese dissidents, including Falun Gong, got thrown in the right-wing camp because of that, because of those beliefs. Now, what's strange about that is if you look at the Falun Gong community in the United States, what are we talking about? Mostly first generation, highly educated Chinese that are here. It's hardly the picture, the standard picture of a white ring group. But so that took hold in the US and the CCP really pushed that. So these types of narratives are stuff that the CCP tries to push to try and malign Falun Gong here in the United States.
Very interesting. And I think we're approaching the end of our program here.
That's right. And so we will be going online now. So to see the rest of our program, go to ntd.com. And for everyone who's joined us so far, and to Levi Browdy, the Executive Director of the Falun Dafa Information Center, thank you very much for joining us. But actually,
one more thing before we leave. I think it's important again to highlight. You touched on how it's important to take action. Can you walk us through that again? What should people do, and why is it important? Because I think a lot of times it can feel like a drop in the bucket or in the ocean, even in this case. So, why is it important, and how should people take action?
Right. So I think it's important for the moral reason. We can't live in a world where we have people who are embracing truthfulness, compassion, and forbearance being tortured specifically for that. We can't allow that. And so, but there's a lot of things people can do. You can call your representative and tell them to get behind these bills that are going to work to stop forced organ harvesting and protect Falun Gong. Those are two bills before Congress. You can share this material. Go to our website, faluninfo.net. There are documentaries there. There are things you can share. Raise the awareness of people so they understand what the CCP is really up to. And including on our website are those family rescue cases. So if you want to write a letter or help get somebody's mother or brother that's being wrongfully imprisoned in China out, you can do it right there.
And Levi, before we leave, I'd like to ask, why should Americans care? How is it affecting Americans or Chinese Americans?
I think the Falun Gong issue is the canary in the coal mine for CCP tyranny more broadly. If you look at what they've done to Falun Gong, you are seeing echoes of that, shades of that being done to other groups, and certainly being done to aspects of our economy, aspects of Hollywood, our media, our government. The things that they're doing against Falun Gong, they're doing much more broadly. And so I think it's not just a Falun Gong issue. This is a CCP tyranny issue. And if we can stop them on the persecution of Falun Gong, that means we can pretty much stop them on any front.
Well, thank you for that, Levi. And now this concludes the televised version of our program. We're going to go online now, so to see the rest, you can go to ntd.com. And for all of those who've joined us, and to Levi and Evelyn, thank you very much. And to you, our audience who've joined us on TV, thank you, and online. Thank you very much. We'll see you online, hopefully.
Welcome back to those online. Thank you for transitioning with us to the web, and we are continuing our program here. Going back to the interview that you had with DAFO, or Doctors Against Forced Organ Harvesting representative, I just think this level of brainwashing is absolutely mind-boggling, because that must mean that there are hundreds or thousands of doctors and surgeons that are cooperating with this, basically murdering people on demand. And suddenly, as we have touched on earlier, there is millions of people that changed their minds on Falun Gong, something that was praised in the media prior to 1999. So incredible how the CCP has this far-reaching influence on people and is able to instigate something so unfathomable. So let's explore this more. Let's bring in Mickey Willis. He is the writer, director, and producer of The Great Awakening, where he looked very closely at the nature of communism and its threats. It's great to have you today, because I wanted to ask you why, well, you included Chinese dissidents in your film, and some of them were Falun Gong practitioners. So why did you think it's important to hear what they have to say?
Well, I think they're some of the most persecuted people on the planet right now, and if we need to pay close attention to what's happened to them, because I think that their experience is almost a blueprint for what could potentially happen to all of us. To understand that, here's one example. So they built the Great Firewall, and they used Falun Gong really as the justification. They demonized Falun Gong as some horrible cult. And then they convince the citizens that we need to build a firewall to stop things like this from happening and spreading. And now that firewall is being used against all Chinese citizens. How does the CCP have this kind of control over these people? Let's say during the Cultural Revolution, they were convinced to tell on each other, tell on their family members, even if that meant to send them into that's a death sentence. That question you ask is so important, because when you can understand what Mao Zedong did in the 60s, and that none of these dictators, Mao, Lenin, Mussolini, Hitler, none of them would have been able to do what they did if it weren't for the citizens and certain factions within their own military doing the dirty work for them. So it's what we call it in the film, and what a lot of experts have called it, is mass formation. That's brainwashing. And so they come out with this idea that service to the party is above all else, and that they're actually rewarded for turning in their own parents and celebrated when their parents are tortured and executed. How does and these are ultimately good people, I would believe, that are just moved into doing something so horrific that you now see videos online of these people that did this, and now they're in their 80s, tearfully regretting what they had done now that they they're awake from that hypnosis. They know that when they scare us, they understand scientifically what happens. It literally puts us into a fight or flight mode, where our ability to critically think gets shut down. And now we're just in survival mode, and we can't make the highest choices. It's just about survival. So if we see that the opportunity to join the dictator means we might survive, all logic goes out the window. Every nation that has ever experienced this. At one point, their citizens said exactly that. Well, thank God that can't happen here. We're in Poland, or we're in Cuba, or we're at whatever, and it happened there. And it's happening all around the world right now. But the good news is this. I always like to leave people with the good news. We have technologies now that we've never had before. So when Mao Zedong was hosting his reign of terror on his own people, there was only the state-sponsored 1, 2, or 3 channels. There was no alternative information. There was no way for them to do what you and I are doing right now, sharing information from afar. We have the ability now to wake up and to stay awake, and to be the first generation in history to recognize what's happening and to stop it before it goes too far, and to ensure that it never happens again. And I believe, I fully believe, that we will be victorious in this particular battle.
I think that's a very good ending to this interview, and let's leave it at that. I think big compliment to your film. I think no matter what somebody's stance or opinion is on this, it makes you think, definitely, and that's what's important. So thank you so much, Mickey Willis. I really appreciate your time today.
Thank you so much.
Well, frankly spoken, some of the ideas may sound far-fetched. We have heard experts talking about the ideological subversion, psychological warfare. But after what we heard throughout this program today about the intense propaganda, the enormous investments made by the CCP for spreading it, we also know about the grip they have on Hollywood that's been in the news, the covert police stations. It just makes you wonder how successful they have been and why the West hasn't reacted to it as we would expect. So we want to find out more about the transnational repression from China caused by the CCP. We're joined by Benedict Rogers now. He is the co-founder and chief executive of Hong Kong Watch. He also wrote the book, The China Nexus. It's good to have you. Benedict, let's first talk about the covert police stations around the world that have been all over the news recently. How long have those actually been around before they were discovered like that?
Well, I think it's unknown really how long they've been around, but certainly for a while. And I think our governments and our law enforcement agencies have been very slow to act.
And on that point that you just made about governments being quite slow, in Dublin, for example, they put up a sign with English translation that read Fuzhou Police Overseas Service Station. So this is quite out in the open. I'm wondering, what does it say to you about what the underlying problem is here that this just went unnoticed?
And if you look, for example, at the case last October in the United Kingdom, where Chinese diplomats in the Chinese consulate in Manchester physically assaulted a group of peaceful Hong Kong protesters, actually dragged one of them into the grounds of the consulate. The British government's response was not to expel those diplomats immediately, which is what I think they should have done. It was to hide behind a police inquiry into the incident, when really there was no need for a police inquiry because the evidence was pretty clear. The Chinese consul general himself actually almost proudly admitted to being part of the incident. And we then allowed those diplomats to leave the country without any real penalty. And that kind of thing has been happening for some years in different ways. So I think the underlying problem is that our response has been slow and weak. And as a result, Beijing's interpreted that as an opportunity to move to the next red line and see if it can test us and cross those red lines again and again.
Reuters reported this, that 2 Chinese men were arrested in LA because they were trying to strip the tax-exempt status off of a U.S. entity that was basically run by Falun Gong practitioners. So when we hear those reports that talk about harassment and intimidation, what exactly does that entail? Because we hear about blackmailing dissidents for them to return to China, but it seems to go beyond that as well. So if you can break down some of the other things that are happening.
I think there are 2 sort of sets of actions. One is relating to individuals outside of China in Western countries, and the other relates to their families back home. So what we've seen around the world is cases such as the one you've mentioned. I've received numerous threatening letters at my home address. My neighbours in a suburb of London have received such letters. Even my mother has received letters telling her to tell me, her son, to stop doing what I'm doing.
What do they threaten you with?
Well, that's right. I don't have any family connections in China or Hong Kong, and I don't have any assets there or any entity there. I've had two main types of threats. The anonymous letters that I've received have mainly just been broadly threatening and abusive without any very specific threat. But I have also received two letters about a year ago, just over a year ago, one from the Hong Kong police force and one from the Hong Kong National Security Bureau, telling me that unless I cease my activities within 72 hours of receipt of this letter, I could face a very heavy fine and a prison sentence in Hong Kong. I also, on one occasion, when I was traveling in Canada, I was going to Vancouver, and this was perhaps the most specific threat. I received an anonymous email basically saying, "See you at," and it gave the name of the hotel that I was booked to stay in Vancouver. And I obviously had not advertised or publicized my hotel details. I had publicized my visit to Vancouver, but not the hotel I was staying in. And so I took security advice on that occasion and just quietly changed hotels.
Thank you so much, Benedict Rogers. I appreciate you speaking to us despite all the threats that you receive. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
And at this point, we want to tie things together here. So joining me now is Joshua Phillip. He is a senior investigative journalist at the Epoch Times and the host of Crossroads tonight on Epoch TV. It's really good to have you, Josh, because prior to speaking to you, we heard about many things like the genocide inside China, but also CCP critics that are being threatened abroad, the covert police stations, the grip on Hollywood, et cetera, et cetera. So can you give us the bigger picture and tell us how it fits into, the CCP's goal and why they are doing all these things?
When we think about war, we usually think about tanks and guns and jets and these types of things. We don't think about war in terms of what war has actually become. And let me explain. The United States has changed its focus on war. When we talk about terrorism and, the wars we just fought for a very long time, it also was not technically about tanks and bombs and guns and jets. It was about ideas. And for the Chinese Communist Party, they understand that ideas are what shape everything, because they understand that ideas and belief are what actually shape societies. And they understand that their own narratives cannot withstand the light of day. It's because of this that the Chinese Communist Party has an actual warfare doctrine adopted into its military code. It's called the Three Warfares.
So the goal is to push through their ideology and hold on and fortify that in the world. Is that correct? Am I understanding that correctly?
That is absolutely correct. And this ties into, I think, even the nature of communism itself. We oftentimes think that we're fighting against an economic theory, or we're fighting against political theories. In reality, communism is closer to a religion. It's a religion that needs to destroy all other beliefs in order to survive. Because once you see its ideas in practice, we see historically that people tend to revolt against it. And you see also that once it does achieve power, the very first thing it does, aside from destroying all traditional belief and the memory of what once was, is they also try to destroy, again, culture and other things, but try to crush any emerging beliefs. When the CCP set out to persecute Falun Gong, that was one of the big narratives that came out from Jiang Zemin, the head of the CCP. He argued that the values of Falun Gong, truthfulness, compassion, tolerance, that these were antithetical to the atheistic doctrine of the CCP, a doctrine based in the theory of struggle. People fighting against you can't have the idea of communist struggle, of class struggle, of struggling to get ahead of everybody else, of vying for power and vying for money and vying for control, if people believe in looking inside themselves and trying to be moral people. If people believe that they should be kind and compassionate and honest, those are antithetical to the idea of struggle that the CCP represents.
So let me ask you this then, when we talking about the war that you mentioned earlier, we are seeing the U.S. changing narratives, Europe slowly as well. So where are we standing right now in this war?
Well, for a long time, the CCP had a policy of the peaceful rise of China, the idea of hiding their strength and biding their time. Xi Jinping kind of backed off of this, and I think to the detriment of the CCP, ironically. It was during COVID that I think a lot of the world woke up. They're a socialist country with a communist ideology and a communist leadership that is very much still interested in bringing about this whole communist revolution, what they call the China model, and spreading it to every corner of the world. And if they gain more power, they're going to use it for that purpose. I think the West is finally waking up, and I think that's a good development, but they're only now starting to wake up.
Well, that's good to hear, at least. So thank you so much, Joshua Phillip, for your time today. I appreciate it.
Hey, pleasure. Thank you.
What we have seen now is a global phenomenon known as Tuidong. Translated from Chinese, it means quitting the CCP. The global movement to quit the CCP has grown rapidly since it began in late 2004. Since then, it has grown significantly to over 400 million people quitting the CCP. Chinese people, both inside and outside China, are waking up to the atrocities of the Chinese Communist Party. Quitting the CCP means denouncing one's membership in the Communist Party's three branches: the Communist Party, the Youth League, and the Young Pioneers. Chinese people of all ages are quitting en masse, declaring their independence from the Communist Party. They can do so through the official Tuidong or Quit the CCP website. And now let's look at a short explanation about this movement.
Tuidong.
Levi, tell us more about the significance of this movement. Why is it important?
I think what's interesting, first of all, is the origin. When the persecution was raging in China in the early 2000s, very quickly there were large numbers of Falun Gong practitioners that realized that the state-run media is just going to keep demonizing them. They can't necessarily wait for the cavalry to come in from the West. And they decided they needed to take their message directly to the people. And so at great risk to themselves, in basements and back rooms of their apartments, they would buy printers and they'd start creating these leaflets that would tell what's really happening to Falun Gong. And not just in the macro, but sometimes it's like there was a prison down the street and this person tortured this person to death. They put that in a flyer and they'd hand it out. So that had some effect. It was called local shaming, where someone, these kind of crimes were seeing the light of day, but they were really hitting a brick wall. And that brick wall was the propaganda that people had been raised with. They'd been so saturated with it, they weren't willing to really hear or believe a narrative that wasn't told them to the state-run media, not even conscious that they were doing it. And I think at a grassroots level, the Falun Gong community realized that people were not going to hear this unless they knew the truth of where that propaganda came from, unless they knew the truth about the CCP. And so they started distributing a book that is now very famous, The 9 Commentaries on the Communist Party. And that really, for the first time in most people's lives, it gave them a full picture of the history of the CCP, how it maintains power. And out of that awareness came this grassroots movement for people standing up saying, I no longer want to be associated with this Communist Party. I want to quit. And so Overseas Human Rights Organization gave them the facility, gave them the website, and it became a mass movement across China to quit the Communist Party.
And incredibly courageous. It's so dangerous to stand up inside China for their beliefs. So according to the website, 415, I believe the banner is actually said 416 million, close to 416 now, million people quit the party. But it seems that in 2021, there were only a little under 100 million party members. So how do these two informations go together?
Well, you're really looking at all three of those organizations, the Young Pioneers, the Youth League, and the former Communist Party. I mean, the Young Pioneers is kind of a mass organization. By the time, once you're 6 and you start going to school, you're pretty much a member. And so if you look across all those organizations, it's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of millions of people. And I think what people are feeling, again, you have to sort of go back to what's really going on, what's spurring this, is that they're understanding the real history of the CCP, and they're saying, I want to break from that. I don't want to be a part of it. Even if they were only enrolled as maybe like a young pioneer when they were 7 or 8. Some are full-on party members, some are part of the youth league. So it draws from people who've had some sort of membership in any of those 3 organizations.
And we just saw that people are out on the street today, thousands of people in Washington, D.C., and we have, we're here in the studio, but in China, there's millions of people passing out leaflets of this information. What are the conditions like in China for these people?
Well, it's very dangerous, and if you hand out a leaflet of Falun Gong or advocate for Falun Gong or send a report, first-hand account of someone who was tortured in prison to a website outside of China. The CCP considers information about the persecution of Falun Gong a state secret. That means it's tantamount to treason to do that. You're punished heavily. We have cases of people who've been picked up, detained, tortured, and even killed, not necessarily because they're a Falun Gong practitioner, because they were doing this. They were handing out material, they were sending that material overseas.
And to get a clear picture on this, there were 100 million people practicing Falun Gong before the persecution, and then suddenly the persecution happens. How did the CCP change their minds?
I think it became down to something we mentioned earlier is the immediate fear of another campaign targeting a segment of society. The interview from the filmmaker, Mickey, just that we saw before, I think speaks to this very well, is that there is an ingrained fear because they know these campaigns, they know what happens, they know how many people die, they know how many people's families are torn apart. And so that fear drove a certain amount of people to fall in line. They may not believe it, they probably don't, they don't want to follow it, but that fear had driven them. The other thing is the propaganda. I think there's this misconception in the West that propaganda only works on ignorant people. It doesn't. It works on people who are constantly subjected to it over and over again, and it touches their buttons. And I know some of the most intelligent people coming out of China, highly educated people that have blatantly false narratives baked into their heads about the Dalai Lama, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Falun Gong. It works. And so over time, the fear, and over time, the state-run media constantly programming the Chinese people, demonizing Falun Gong, go against Falun Gong, those two together is what really made this persecution possible.
Right, and that's very interesting to your point. And I think Mickey Willis had included something in his film that basically people that spend a lot of time in those, institutions, in the universities, especially in China, when those figures of authority tell them certain things, they grow accustomed to it and they start to believe it. It's also, the more you repeat something, the more likely it is that you believe it, right?
I had this interesting conversation with someone. We were writing the human rights report, and we were talking about how to approach it. And he's a good friend of mine from Beijing. And we weren't seeing it eye to eye. And I finally stopped him and I said, well, wait a minute. You tell me, what makes something a convincing argument for Chinese? And he says, the amount of times you say it and how forcefully you said it. But without even thinking, I was like, really? And he thought about what he just said. It's like, oh, no, that's not right. But it spoke to this psychosis that occurs when you're raised in a country where there's that much fear and that much propaganda pushed on people.
Mm-hmm. With a quick look at the time right now, let's get in one more audience question here. Dan Foley is asking, is there a Falun Gong political party?
No, and there never will be. And I think that is one of the things that scares the CCP the most. Falun Gong never has been nor will be a political force. It is a spiritual practice. It's something sort of ingrained in the individual's heart. We don't even have structures that you find in a normal religion. There's no membership, there's no clergy, there's no buildings you can go to. It's something you just do. And I think that's what really scared the CCP. If it was a political party, you could go down to the headquarters, you could arrest the leadership, it's something tangible you could attack. Falun Gong has always been very dedicated to just being a spiritual practice. Now, a spiritual practice that is brave, that will speak out for when they're being wrongfully persecuted, sure. Political, never. And I think that's one of the things that really scared the CCP.
I think that's a very good and interesting point to think about. Levi Browdy, thank you so much for being here today and giving us such a well-rounded picture of what's happening in China and, of course, outside China as well.
Yes, and we also like to thank our great panelists that we've had on today. And to Evelyn Lee, thank you.
Great working with you.
Yeah, and to our audience, thank you very much for paying attention to this important human rights issue. For more information, go to ntd.com. I'm Jack Bradley.
And I'm Evelyn Lee.
Have a wonderful day.